The last ordinary evening before the breach, held inside one human household beneath Hermon. What does it feel like to stand in an ordinary night that is about to become history? Kodesh, a word for what should remain set apart, a word for what should not be handled carelessly, a word for the clean distance between the holy and the grasping hand. And tonight, dear friend, that is where we begin. Because the birth of the Nephilim does not start in a battlefield, and it does not first arrive as a legend told by frightened old men. It begins before the birth, before the giant, before the violence, before the cries that later rose from the earth. It begins in the pain of a boundary being treated as though it were only a suggestion. So tonight we are not rushing first to the monstrous part of the story. We are going to sit inside the human part. We are going to stand in the ordinary evening before anyone knew the world had tilted. We are going to remain near one lamp, one threshold, one daughter of men, one house settling into night under the long shoulder of Hermon. And the hidden detail that changes the whole feeling of this story is that heaven's rebellion did not become terrible only when the earth filled with violence. It became terrible much earlier, when forbidden desire first learned to look downward and imagine crossing into flesh. That is the moment we will enter. Not yet the child, not yet the wound in full growth. Only the hour before, only the air before, only the human stillness before another order of being decided it would no longer remain within its own estate. The old witness in 1 Enoch begins with multiplication. Human families increase. Daughters are born. Beauty appears on the earth in the simple, creaturely way beauty always does. Not as a weapon, not as a philosophy, not as an invitation to violation, but as a gift of life unfolding in the generations below. That matters tonight, because the story does not begin by blaming the daughters. It begins by naming them as human, beautiful, and seen. The danger enters through the seeing, not through their existence. Stay close to that. A girl can be drawing water. A mother can be binding grain. A sister can be lowering a lamp. A household can be passing into evening, in complete innocence, and history can still be moving toward them from above. This is one of the reasons the story feels so unsettling. The people beneath the coming breach are not standing in ritual rebellion. They are living. They are marrying, carrying, baking, sweeping, tending, laughing, washing the dust from their feet. They are mortal in the ordinary way. They sleep. They wake. They bury their dead. They wait for children. They watch seasons gather and open. The world below the mountain is recognizably human before the collision ever becomes visible. That is where I want to keep the lamp tonight. In the human room. In the breathing world. In the last evening that still feels like all the other evenings. Perhaps there was wind along the stones beneath Hermon. Perhaps sheep settled with their small sounds in the dark. Perhaps the cooking fire thinned and the last vessel was rinsed. Perhaps one young woman, not named for us by the surviving text, stepped outside for a moment and looked at the night sky with the untroubled instinct of a creature living under heaven rather than fearing heaven. She did not know that the distance above her was being studied with hunger. She did not know that beauty had already become an argument in another mouth. That is the first human ache of the title. Not birth yet. Exposure. The ache of being near. A harm you cannot yet perceive. The ache of standing inside innocence while another will is already bending toward trespass. And, because this is a night script, because we are moving gently and not sensationally, I want to say something plainly. We do not honor this story by making it lurid. We honor it by making it human enough to feel the wrongness. If we rush to spectacle, we miss the first wound. The first wound is not giant size. The first wound is that someone looked at what was not given and decided desire itself should become permission. Jared, In the old memory, this all unfolds in the days of Jared. His name is often linked with the idea of descent, of going down, and whether or not every shade of the name can bear all the sermon freight later readers place upon it, the emotional force is still striking tonight. In Jared's days, something comes down that should have remained above. History becomes a staircase used wrongly. And I always pause there, dear friend, because Scripture is full of holy descents, merciful descents, saving descents. But this descent is not mercy, it is trespass. That difference matters emotionally, not only doctrinally. So imagine the daughters of men in the days of Jared not as symbols first, but as daughters indeed. Daughters with voices. Daughters with mothers. Daughters whose bodies belonged to the patient order of human life. Daughters who had learned the ordinary boundaries of fear and safety, and therefore could not yet imagine a danger shaped like admiration from the heavens. There is something chilling about a threat that arrives in the form of attention. Not attack at first. Attention. A gaze that lingers too long. A regard that ceases to be honoring and becomes taking before the hand has even moved. The old text understands that sequence with terrifying simplicity. They saw, they desired, they spoke, they planned. The birth of the Nephilim begins long before the womb. It begins in the moral corruption of looking. And still, on the earth below, life remains heartbreakingly normal. This is why the title must be handled slowly. The night heaven and earth collided was not first felt as cosmology. It was felt as the strange nearness of danger to daily life. It was felt as a pressure entering the human world before language existed to explain it. It was felt in homes that did not know they were already standing at the edge of an age. I think that is where many listeners quietly recognize something. Some of the deepest human fears are not fears of open catastrophe. They are fears of change arriving before explanation. Fears that the room is no longer as simple as it was yesterday. Fears that what once felt sheltered now carries a pressure no one knows how to name. We will not turn that into therapy tonight. We will leave it inside the story. But we will not refuse to feel it. And because this first chamber is about the last ordinary evening, we should let it stay ordinary a little longer. Not empty, not vague. Ordinary in the holy human sense. A grandmother folds cloth. Someone coughs in the next room. A child asks a final question before sleep. A dog lifts its head and settles again. A vessel cools near the wall. The stars above the ridge look ancient but harmless. Nothing in the scene explains the coming rupture. That is exactly why it wounds the heart. Evil does not always announce itself by changing the furniture of the world at once. Sometimes it approaches while everything familiar is still in its place. I think the woman beneath Hermon might have loved something small that evening. The warmth of bread in her hands, the sound of another woman laughing from the courtyard, the relief of unlacing the day from her body. The simple dignity of belonging to a people who live by seasons, not by spectacle. And perhaps that is why the story must begin before fear. If we do not feel what was peaceful, we will not feel what was violated. If we do not understand the ordinary goodness of mortal life, we will not understand what it means for another order of being to trespass into it. So do not rush past her humanity. Let her remain one whole person for a moment longer. Let her have a name known only to God. Let her have a mother who thinks tomorrow will be ordinary too. Let her have no idea that the sky itself is becoming morally unstable above her tonight. Ordinary life is the holiness at risk here. Bread cooling on a board. Water waiting in a jar. Sandals left by the door. A mother listening for the breathing of her children. These are the goods trespass threatens. The boundary between heaven and earth was not given to diminish human life, but to guard it from powers never meant to enter it this way. That protection is already being tested while the house still seems peaceful. The daughter beneath Hermon does not yet know she is part of a title. She does not yet know. Later generations will speak of Nephilim, giants, watchers, rebellion, corruption, and flood. She only knows the coolness of evening, the weight of the vessel in her hands, the path from doorway to courtyard, the sky above, the ordinary hush. And that is exactly why we begin here. Because if the story is going to remain human, then the first chamber must belong not to mythology, but to an evening, not to a chart, but to a girl, not to doctrine alone, but to the tenderness of a world that has not yet learned how to describe what is coming. The old witness lets us stand in that tenderness for a moment. It does not hurry us. It simply tells us that the children of men multiplied, that daughters were born, and that beauty existed on the earth below. Then the gaze from above begins to gather. The next chamber must enter that terrible seeing and ask what it felt like for human beauty to become the site of forbidden attention. Human beauty becomes the site of forbidden attention, and innocence is watched from above. What does it feel like to be seen by a desire that does not belong to your world? We have come now to the first unbearable sentence in the old account. The daughters of men were seen. There is a way of being seen that is ordinary and good. A child seen by her mother. A bride seen by her beloved. A laborer seen by a neighbor returning at dusk. A weary face seen with kindness. Human life depends upon such seeing. To be unseen is one sorrow, but the Enochic wound uncovers another sorrow entirely. To be seen wrongly, to be noticed by a gaze that does not bless, does not protect, does not honor the limits that make love clean. That is the next human threshold of this story. The daughters of men are not introduced as temptresses. They are introduced as beautiful and comely. The fault enters from above. And I want to linger over that because people sometimes move through this passage too fast, as if beauty itself were the crisis. It is not. The crisis is the corruption of the watcher. The crisis is the will that turns beauty into claim. The crisis is not that human loveliness exists. The crisis is that rebellion learns to speak in the language of wanting. If we are going to read this faithfully, then we must stay near the human ground under the text. Somewhere beneath that ancient sentence are actual women doing actual human things. The surviving account does not hand us their names. It does not tell us which house they came from, what they feared, whether they were old enough to understand the danger gathering around them, whether a mother noticed a strange disturbance in her daughter's silence, whether there were stories beginning to move in whispers through the villages below Hermon. But the text gives us enough to feel the scene. They were there. They were human. And they were seen. That little phrase carries a whole world of emotional disturbance. Seen from where? Seen by whom? Seen with what intent? Seen under what sky? A human being can feel when attention changes temperature. That is true in any age. There is a difference between presence and pressure. A difference between admiration and taking. A difference between being noticed and being hunted. I imagine the first unease did not arrive with theology attached to it. It likely arrived as atmosphere. A sense that evening no longer felt entirely harmless. A sense that the open sky had become too watchful. A sense that what had once been the simple roof of creation now carried a burdened nearness. Sometimes the body recognizes danger before language does. Sometimes the soul feels the shift in a room before the mind can explain it. The birth of the Nephilim begins in that sort of terrible anticipation. Banot ha'adam. The phrase means the daughters of men, or more fully, the daughters of humankind. And emotionally tonight, that matters because the title does not begin with categories, but with daughters. Human daughters, earthborn daughters, women who belong to the line below, to the mortal side of creation, to the patient rhythm of generation, inheritance, blood, and time. When I read that phrase slowly, dear friend, I do not hear abstraction. I hear vulnerability. I hear households. I hear the soft braid of ordinary life before a forbidden will tears through it. The old account says the watchers saw that these daughters were fair, and they desired them. Desire here is not rendered as passing admiration. It becomes deliberate. It becomes conversational. It becomes shared. That is an important movement. We are not yet at the mountain oath, but the corruption is already social. The fallen imagination does not remain inside one inward glance. It seeks agreement. It wants accomplices. Evil likes witnesses of its own, before it ever meets resistance from the righteous. That is why the scene grows darker, the more quietly you read it. A gaze becomes a discussion. A discussion becomes a proposal. A proposal becomes a plan. And all the while, the human world below remains made of flesh, sleep, labor, modest hope, and unguarded thresholds. I want to stay especially close to one unnamed daughter of men, not because the text singles her out, but because your title asks for emotional intimacy, and intimacy requires nearness. Let us imagine her, not as a fantasy figure, but as a person with a body that tires, with hair that gathers the smell of smoke from the house, with feet that know the worn path outside, with someone who expects her back before the lamp goes low. Perhaps there is still flour at her wrist. Perhaps she pauses at the doorway to look at the stars. Perhaps she thinks of nothing dramatic at all, and that is the heartbreak. Her ordinary humanness is part of the scene's innocence. The heavens above her, however, are no longer innocent. There is a phrase I keep returning to in this material: forbidden attention. Not because the text uses that exact English phrase, but because it helps us feel what is happening without turning the women into scenery. The daughters are not a backdrop for angelic drama. They are the human site where cosmic rebellion becomes intimate. The boundary between worlds is not crossed first in a creed or in a war. It is crossed in a tension that refuses reverence. And perhaps this is where I am as a pastor. Must speak gently but clearly. One of the oldest lies in the world is that desire justifies itself by intensity. That if the wanting is strong enough, the boundary must be negotiable. The Watcher's tradition exposes that lie with terrifying force. The wanting is real. The boundary is still holy. And once a being decides that desire outranks holiness, everyone below that decision becomes vulnerable. So how did the daughters feel the first hints of it? The text does not say directly, but it gives us room to remain human. Maybe conversation in the village altered. Maybe men who should have sounded settled sounded restless instead. Maybe strange reports traveled from one family to another. Maybe sleep became less easy. Maybe the night sky became less companionable. Maybe one woman noticed she no longer liked to walk alone at the same hour she used to. Maybe mothers grew watchful without knowing why. Maybe no one had words large enough yet. So the fear remained small and domestic, and therefore even more difficult to resist. That is often how disaster first approaches a human world. Not all at once. Not with its final name. First is disquiet. First is altered atmosphere. First is a pressure that seems too slight to justify alarm and too persistent to ignore. That is the human realism we must not lose. If we skip too quickly to giants, we miss the daughters. If we skip too quickly to judgment, we miss the women. If we skip too quickly to doctrine, we miss the house. And if we miss the house, then the birth of the Nephilim becomes only spectacle instead of sorrow. The Watchers, in this part of the old story, are still in the stage of looking and speaking to one another. They have not yet descended, but the decision is gestating in them the way dread begins to gestate in a threatened world. Even that parallel matters. There is a dark counterfeit here. Human bodies were meant to carry life, according to created blessing. Rebellion now carries its own intention, swelling toward embodiment in secret. The violation begins in the inward chamber before it ever enters the outward chamber. That is why the title can be trusted with quietness. We do not need to exaggerate it. The material is already severe. A group of heavenly beings looks upon mortal daughters and begins to imagine possession. That alone is enough to make the night air feel changed. And still, I want to keep us close to the bodily, the relational, the humanly immediate. Somewhere there is a mother pulling a woven covering across a sleeping child. Somewhere there is a sister braiding another sister's hair. Somewhere there is a woman who notices that her daughter's face has gone inward and asks whether she is ill. Somewhere there is laughter in one courtyard and tension in another. History rarely announces itself evenly. Some houses go on sounding ordinary, while the edge of the age has already entered the next village. There is also a bodily wisdom to this chamber that I do not want to lose. A threatened world often feels the shift before it can frame the cause. One woman becomes unusually quiet. Another avoids the well at dusk. Another says the evening air feels wrong and cannot explain why. An older mother grows more watchful with her daughters. A father begins to call everyone inside sooner than he used to. The village still functions, but a low unease has entered the rhythm. This is how the scene remains human. The text tells us the watchers saw the daughters, but the body below that sentence may already be learning the weather of danger. And perhaps the daughters themselves felt the confusion of being looked at without knowing how to speak about it. Not all fear arrives as panic. Sometimes it arrives as self-consciousness that was not there before, as a feeling that the path you have walked 100 times is no longer the same path, as a reluctance to lift your eyes toward the sky, as the strange burden of feeling exposed in a world that had once felt wide and clean. The old account does not hand us those interior lines, but its logic permits them, and human honesty almost requires them. This is why I do not want the listeners to hear as a mere setup for giants. It is already a sorrow in itself for beauty to become unsafe. It is already a wound for a daughter to learn that being seen can turn from blessing into pressure. It is already a corruption of creation when watchfulness becomes predation. Even before descent, something sacred in the relation between heaven and earth is breaking. The sky is no longer simply above. It is beginning to lean, and still, the women remain daughters of men. The phrase protects them from being swallowed by the mythology of later readers. They are not props in a supernatural drama. They are the human center of the scene. Their vulnerability is not decorative. It is the cost of rebellion moving toward embodiment. So let the chamber stay with them long enough to feel the ache properly. Let us hear the water jar set down more carefully than usual. Let us notice the pause at the doorway. Let us feel the slight inward turning of a soul that does not yet know how much its innocence is being watched. Sometimes, the most haunting part of a story is not what has happened, but what has begun to feel different before anyone can prove why. The daughters of men stand inside that threshold here. Their world is still human, yet something in the air has shifted. The silence of the text is not emptiness. It is the silence of a doorway before it is crossed, of a household before the knock, of a body before it fully understands the danger gathering around it in the dark. Even the ordinary stars feel altered, as though distance itself had leaned too near the earth below. The word carries the sense of those who watch, those who are wakeful. And that is part of the tragedy. Watching can be holy. Watching can mean guarding. Watching can mean faithful attention under God. But in this story, the watcher becomes corrupt. Sight is detached from obedience. Wakefulness is emptied of reverence. I always feel the sorrow of that inversion, dear friend. A gift meant for stewardship becomes a machinery of trespass. They do not cease to see. They cease to see cleanly. That corruption of seeing is why this section must remain tender and not theatrical. The daughters of men are not merely the occasion of the plot. They are the first human cost of a gaze that has forgotten worship. The night heaven and earth collided begins here, in the misused eye, in the inward consent to violation, in the terrible moment when the distance between realms begins to feel negotiable to the ones who should have protected it most. And yet the descent has not happened. That matters too. We are in the terrible interval, where evil is still deciding itself out loud. The women below are vulnerable. The heavens above are unstable. The mountain waits, and the next chamber must listen to the conversation among the rebels themselves, because the fall deepens when desire seeks agreement and imagination hardens into oath. Rebellion becomes collective, chosen, and organized before it ever reaches the human home. When does a fall stop being private and become shared? There is a difference between a terrible thought passing through a mind and that same thought being spoken aloud until others agree to it. That difference is where this chamber begins. The old story does not present the watchers as drifting carelessly into wrongdoing one by one. It presents a dark deepening. They look. They desire. Then they speak together. Then they fear the cost. Then they bind themselves to the deed, so that none may turn back alone. The descent is not only lustful, it is organized. The trespass is given fellowship. That is one of the most chilling details in 1 Enoch 6. Evil here is not merely appetite. It is planning. It is administration. It is consensus built around a wound. And before we climb with them toward Hermon, I want to keep one foot on the earth below, because every oath they are about to make will fall eventually into human rooms. Every sentence spoken among the rebels is moving toward a mother, a body, a birth, a village, a generation. The reason we listen to the heaven-side conversation is not because it flatters curiosity. It is because those words become the weather of human sorrow. The ringleader in the old account is often rendered Shemihazah or Shemihazah in other forms. He fears that the others will shrink back and leave the blame resting on him alone. There is something very revealing in that fear. Even in rebellion, the conscience remembers consequence enough to want company. Evil seeks not only permission, but distribution. It wants guilt shared. It wants burden diluted across many hands. So the leader speaks, and the others answer. And the corruption becomes corporate before it becomes embodied. Shemihazah. The name reaches us through layered forms, and translators render it a little differently, but in the surviving register he stands as the chief voice at this threshold. Emotionally tonight he matters because he is not merely a symbol of evil in general. He is the one who knows enough to fear solitary blame and still proceeds. I always slow down there, dear friend, because some of the darkest choices in any age are made by people who are not ignorant of wrongness. They simply prefer shared wrongdoing to solitary restraint. Listen to the structure of the temptation. Not only I desire, but come with me. Not only this boundary attracts me, but let us cross it together. Not only I want, but let us make wanting official. That movement from inward desire to outward pact is one of the title's hidden hinges. The birth of the Nephilim does not begin with biology. It begins with solidarity in rebellion. A company of beings agrees that holiness will no longer govern desire. The child comes later. The oath comes first. And if we remain human while reading this, we can feel how dreadful that is. Somewhere below, the daughters of men do not know that above them, a conversation is turning their vulnerability into a plan. They do not know that their names, though not recorded for us individually, are already being replaced in another order of speech by categories of selection. Choice becomes choosing, seeing becomes taking, personhood becomes quarry. That is why the emotional texture of this chamber must remain restrained and sorrowful. We do not need cinematic thunder. The speech itself is enough. Come, let us choose. Those are domestic verbs in ordinary life. Human families use them for bread, for marriage, for journeys, for shared labor. Here they are darkly repurposed. Fellowship is bent away from goodness and used to strengthen violation. There is another detail in the passage that matters deeply. The leader is afraid the others will not dare the action, and the punishment will fall on him alone. So they swear together. That means rebellion is being stabilized by mutual fear. Not courage, not love, fear. Fear of isolated cost. Fear of personal exposure. Fear of carrying guilt without the comfort of shared participation. How modern that feels. How ancient. How terribly recognizable. Many human wrongs ripen the same way. One conscience weakens. Then it recruits others. Then the group becomes a shelter from shame. Then the oath to continue feels stronger than the warning not to begin. This is one reason the Book of the Watchers still reads as moral diagnosis rather than mere antique myth. It understands collective transgression with painful clarity. But keep returning, within 2 sentences, to the title's Human Room. Why? Because somewhere beneath this pact is still a future birth room. Somewhere beneath this conversation is still a woman who does not know that her body is being approached by a decision already ratified above. Somewhere beneath this oath is still the first cry of the child that has not yet entered the world. That is what gives the rebel conversation its human weight. It is not abstract evil. It is pending intimacy. It is planned collision. It is heaven bending downward, not in annunciation, not in covenant mercy, not in holy overshadowing, but in appetite severed from obedience. That distinction must stay bright tonight. Scripture gives us sacred descents elsewhere. God comes near. Glory descends. The Spirit overshadows. Holy things enter history by gift. The Watcher's narrative is the blasphemous parody of that pattern. A downward movement still occurs, but stripped of purity, stripped of blessing, stripped of divine permission. The result is not life in harmony, but life crossed, burdened, enlarged beyond order, and finally driven toward violence. Hermon. The mountain name is often linked with the oath itself in this story, because there, the rebels bind themselves under an imprecation. Hermon becomes more than geography. It becomes memory of a sworn wound. And emotionally, that is why the mountain matters tonight. Mountains in Scripture can be places of revelation, covenant, fire, law, blessing. Here, a mountain becomes the shelf on which rebellion signs its own name. I never read that without grief. Even landscape is made to carry the memory of a decision against holiness. Before we arrive at the oath itself in the next section, we need to feel the moral air of this pre-oath chamber. The beings involved still know enough to speak about consequence. They know enough to name the deed as costly. They know enough to fear punishment. And yet none of that knowledge ripens into repentance. Instead, it ripens into strategy. That is a devastating sentence, dear friend. To know enough to fear, and not enough to stop. Or rather, not enough willingness to stop. It is one thing to fall through blindness. It is another to construct a brotherhood of trespass while still aware that judgment exists. And perhaps that is where the human listener feels the ache in a new way. So much suffering in the world comes not from pure ignorance, but from chosen reinforcement, from people agreeing together to cross what one person alone might still have feared, from groups becoming machines for what solitary conscience still finds unbearable. The Watcher's story sees that mechanism and places it near the beginning of the flood corruption. So let us imagine the mountain path before the oath is spoken aloud. Figures gathering, resolve hardening. No thunder yet, no infant yet, no village cry yet. Just the inward finality that comes when a group decides that warning will not govern them. It is a dreadful kind of liturgy. Words, witnesses, mutual obligation, sealed intent. The unholy can imitate structure because structure itself is not enough to sanctify a deed. That is another reason this material should be written slowly. Listeners often assume corruption is always chaotic at the start, but this passage shows us something subtler. Corruption can begin with order, with agreements, with ranks, with named leadership, with disciplined intention. The disorder erupts later in the human world. The planning itself feels almost composed, which makes it all the more terrifying. Below the mountain, however, the human world is still sleeping and waking in the old way. A girl draws water. A father counts animals. A mother rubs oil into weary hands. A household prepares bread. No one below has consented to become the field where this oath will bear fruit. That is why the next movement in the story is so grave. Once rebellion binds itself by oath, dissent is no longer fantasy. It is imminent. And once dissent becomes imminent, the women below are no longer merely being watched. They are being approached. There is a human sadness in the rebel dialogue that reaches farther than the mountain itself. Every time a powerful being asks others to join him in transgression, someone below pays for that fellowship. The Watchers are not risking only themselves. Their pact is moving toward women who never voted on it, toward children not yet conceived, toward fathers who will not know how to protect their homes from a category of danger their world has never seen. That is why the oath matters so much. It is the moment the future suffering of others is accepted as collateral. I want to slow down there. Accepted as collateral. That is one of the darkest emotional truths in the chamber. The rebels know punishment exists. They know the act carries dread. But the fear that one of them might bear the blame alone becomes more persuasive to them than the thought of what their dissent will do to the human world. Shared guilt feels more urgent than human safety. That inversion is part of the fall. And if we remain near the future mother beneath the mountain, the horror sharpens. She is not present in the council. She cannot interrupt it. She cannot appeal her case. She cannot say that her body is not a site for angelic experiment, that her household is not open ground for heavenly appetite, that her unborn children are not raw material for a rebellion staged elsewhere. The entire pact forms above her absence. That, too, belongs to the human pain of the title. So the pre-descent chamber is not merely about what the Watchers are thinking. It is about the helplessness of those who do not yet know they are already being drawn into the consequences of someone else's vow. There are seasons in Scripture when heaven bends downward in rescue. This is not one of them. Here, heaven bends downward in misuse, and the earth below has no shield except the holiness the rebels have decided to ignore. That is why the mountain must feel cold before anyone ever stands upon it. Not because of wind alone, but because intention has made the air severe. A company of rebels has chosen reinforcement over repentance. They are closer now to one another than to obedience. And whenever that happens, history is usually about to become heavier for the innocent. This is why we must not become abstract. A collective fall is still measured by human consequences. Every shared act of rebellion creates someone else's private sorrow. Every pact above the mountain moves toward a particular doorway below it. Every vow made among the powerful eventually enters the life of someone with less power, less warning, and fewer ways to resist. That is what makes the pre-descent chamber so heavy. It is not only about what the Watchers are becoming. It is about what innocent people are about to endure, because the Watchers chose companionship in evil over lonely obedience to the good. The oath is heavy, because its confidence is borrowed from numbers, while the people below it remain singular, mortal, unconsulted, and heartbreakingly exposed to us. The oath. The text places tremendous weight on the act of swearing together. This is not decorative detail. It tells us the deed is being fortified against second thoughts. A shared curse is laid upon withdrawal. Emotionally, I hear in that a horrible inversion of covenant fidelity. What should bind beings toward the good is turned into a chain fastening them toward violation. The form of seriousness remains, but the holiness is gone. That is why the chamber feels so cold. And before we leave it, I want to speak one pastoral sentence into the dark without drifting away from the title. Some of the worst moments in history begin when a group decides that mutual agreement is enough to sanctify desire. It is not. 10 voices cannot baptize one trespass. 200 wills cannot make a boundary unholy. The daughters of men remain human. The created order remains real. The distance between heaven and earth remains meaningful even when rebels vow to ignore it. That is the strength of the human side of the story. The victims do not become less human because power conspires against them. The household does not become less sacred because the mountain above has gone dark. The future mother does not become less worthy of reverence because another will has reduced her to selection. Hold that firmly. The title is not about monsters first. It is about violation entering history and becoming flesh. It is about a collision planned before it is born. It is about the dreadful interval in which the oath has been made. But the human world below still has one last innocent darkness before the footfall of descent. The next chamber must climb fully onto Hermon and hear the sworn wound itself, because after that, the story no longer belongs only to the air above the mountain. After that, it begins moving toward houses, women, and wombs. Rebellion stops hovering as imagination and is sealed by oath above a sleeping human world. What changes when rebellion is not imagined, but sworn? Now we climb the mountain. Not because the mountain is the human center of the story. It is not. The human center still waits below, in houses, in women, in the line of mortal generations. But we must come here because the story itself insists that the descent toward human flesh was not casual. It was ratified. It was spoken into firmness. It was bound by oath. And if the birth of the Nephilim is ever going to be understood as more than legend, then we must hear how the air above Hermon became morally cold before the first mother ever felt the burden of that coldness in her own body. The old account says, the Watchers descended upon Mount Hermon and swore together. The mountain receives their agreement the way a witness receives testimony. But this witness is unwilling. Hermon is not consenting to the deed. It is forced to carry its memory. That is why the place matters emotionally. A landscape that should have been only landscape becomes archive. Stone remembers what holiness did not authorize. There is something grievous in that. Mountains in scripture are often where distance closes cleanly. Law is given. Prophets hear. Altars rise. Cloud and fire become signs of God's nearness. But Hermon, in this chamber, becomes the site of a counterfeit nearness. Not revelation, intrusion, not obedience, consolidated trespass. The form of solemnity remains, but the heart of it is rotten. That is why this section must be written with grief, not thrill. We are hearing liturgy turned inside out. In the Enochic memory, Hermon is tied to the oath because there the rebels bound themselves together under a curse if they failed to carry through the deed. The mountain name itself becomes inseparable from sworn rebellion in the tradition. And emotionally tonight, that matters, because geography is receiving a wound. The earth, which was given as the home of human generations, is forced to host the formalizing of a plot against those generations. I always slow down there, dear friend, because when a place becomes identified with violation, the sadness of the story deepens. Even the stones have to keep the secret. Try to hear the moment without cinematic excess. No need to turn the scene into thunder for its own sake. The terror is already present. A company gathers. Speech hardens. Intent stiffens. No one can later say this happened by accident. That is what the oath achieves. It removes the refuge of vagueness. It says, we know what we are doing. We know it carries consequence. And we are choosing it anyway. And once that is said, the emotional atmosphere of the title changes. Until now, we have been living in threat. Now we move into inevitability. That is what an oath does in a story like this. It turns desire into structure. It gives appetite ceremony. It grants rebellion the cold dignity of planning. That is why it feels so severe. Evil here does not begin as chaos. It begins by borrowing order. The rebels take something covenantal in form and bend it toward desecration. They use mutual obligation not to guard the holy, but to protect one another from repentance. That phrase matters. Protected from repentance. Many people imagine evil as reckless and impulsive. Sometimes it is. But there is another form of evil that is more composed. It does not want interruption. It does not want a late return of conscience. It builds systems so that turning back feels more costly than moving forward. The Watchers do exactly that here. They fear one might withdraw. They fear one might hesitate. So they swear against hesitation itself. And below the mountain, the daughters of men still do not know. Keep returning there, because every sentence spoken above them is moving downward. Every rebel voice is already leaning into a future household. Every vow is already casting its shadow into a womb that is not yet conceived. This is the title return lore of the section. Hermon matters because Hermon sends its oath into human life. That is why I imagine the night below still feeling deceptively normal while the oath is made above. A child might still be asleep with one arm flung over a woven blanket. An older woman might still be rubbing tired knees before lying down. A young daughter might still be brushing dust from her hem. A wife might still be speaking softly to her husband about grain, weather, or the next day's labor. None of them asked for the mountain to become a council chamber of defiance. None of them know that the air above their homes now carries a sealed decision against the peace of the created order. That helplessness is part of what makes the oath so painful. The people below are absent from the decision that will enter their lives. No appeal, no witness for the defense, no warning sent in advance. Only the mountain keeping the sound of words no human family consented to hear. Shemihazah. The name comes to us in variant forms, but the narrative role is consistent. The leader who fears solitary punishment, and therefore gathers the others into joint obligation. He matters emotionally because he reveals how rebellion often justifies itself through company. A lone conscience may still tremble. A chorus of determined wills can make trembling feel shameful. I find that psychologically exact. Once the group has pledged itself, repentance begins to look like betrayal of the group rather than return to the good. That is one of the coldest turns in the whole prelude to the Nephilim birth. And if we write this humanly, we must ask what the oath sounds like when translated into earthly consequence. It sounds like a future mother having no language for the pressure about to enter her life. It sounds like fathers being unable to guard what they do not yet understand. It sounds like daughters going to sleep under a sky that has already agreed against them. It sounds like one generation inheriting the decision of another order of being. That is why the mountain scene cannot remain abstract theology. It is the legal chamber of a future sorrow. The oath is not interesting simply because it is ancient. It is heartbreaking because it is effective. The story is telling us that corruption is not merely inward drift. It can become coordinated resolve, and when power coordinates itself against the innocent, history grows heavy very quickly. There is another feature of the oath that deserves attention. The rebels bind themselves under mutual curse if they fail to accomplish the plan. Think about that for a moment. They are not simply promising action. They are threatening one another against retreat. This is what makes the section feel almost liturgical in the worst possible sense. There is invocation, there is obligation, there is an unseen audience, there is sealed intention. Form is not absent here. Holiness is absent. That difference is everything. The world always becomes more dangerous when ceremony is detached from righteousness, because ceremony makes evil feel legitimate to the ones performing it. It lends weight. It lends memory. It lends the false nobility of seriousness. That is why Hermon becomes the mountain of the sworn wound, not simply the mountain of descent. The wound begins in the oath. The body receives it later. And perhaps this is the right place for a brief vulnerability line that remains inside the title. One of the loneliest forms of fear is realizing that harm can be decided far above you before it ever touches you. A child knows nothing of counsels. A household knows nothing of sealed agreements. A mother may feel the consequence before she ever learns the cause. We will not turn that into a broad healing monologue. We will leave it here, where it belongs, inside the sorrow of innocent people living under decisions they never made, because that is exactly what the daughters of men are about to endure. The oath makes the descent more than possible. It makes it committed, and once commitment is sealed, the path downward shortens. Now imagine the moment after the words are spoken. No giant has yet been born. No violent hunger yet fills the earth. But the moral order has been pierced at a very high level. The mountain stands under it. The heavens do not become cleaner by speaking it aloud. The earth does not become safer by not yet knowing. Silence follows. Perhaps a terrible sort of stillness. Perhaps the kind of stillness that comes after something irreversible has been chosen. There is another sorrow on Hermon that deserves a slower sentence. The mountain is high, but the deed being sealed upon it is morally small. That is part of evil's humiliation. It borrows altitude without gaining nobility. It borrows numbers without gaining truth. It borrows solemn speech without gaining righteousness. The watchers stand above the villages, but elevation does not purify appetite. If anything, the scene becomes more tragic, because beings entrusted with watchfulness are using their height against those below them. The moral shape of the chamber is all downward pressure. Those with more reach are choosing those with less protection. Those who should have guarded the boundary are weaponizing proximity to it. Those who should have remained under order are turning order's own forms into tools of trespass. Hermon, then, is not only the mountain of the oath, it is the mountain where height itself is shamed by the will that stands upon it. And perhaps we should imagine the after silence once more. One rebel looks at another. No one speaks of mercy. No one suggests delay. No one says the daughters below are not ours to approach. That absence matters. Sometimes the most chilling feature of a council is not the evil it proposes, but the goodness no one bothers to defend. In that silence, repentance has already been abandoned. The mountain keeps no holy protest. The rebels keep no holy hesitation. Only the oath remains, cooling in the air like iron newly shaped. Once such a thing exists, the story begins leaning downhill. The houses below have not changed in appearance, yet their future has already been wounded. That is why the section must end with gravity rather than spectacle. Hermon has done enough merely by hearing the vow, and there is one more reason the oath chills the heart. It reveals that the Watchers still understand weight. They know vows matter. They know words can bind. They know solemn action carries consequence. In other words, they are not ignorant children stumbling into harm. They are beings using moral knowledge against morality itself. That is always darker than mere impulse. The mountain hears not childish confusion, but disciplined defiance. And disciplined defiance is what makes the later births feel tragic before they ever feel terrible. The children to come will arrive downstream from deliberation, from organized refusal, from a wound prepared in language before it ever appears in flesh. Hermon is where rebellion learned to speak with adult seriousness while abandoning adult responsibility entirely. That contrast should leave the chamber cold tonight for us. And still the villages below remain unaware that the sky over them has already narrowed. They sleep, speak, and rise under an oath they did not make, while the mountain above them keeps the terrible dignity of having heard it there. That stillness matters. Stories often skip too quickly from decision to effect. But the emotional truth of a decision this grave includes the silence after it. The moment when everyone involved knows the boundary is now going to be crossed. The moment when the possibility of not doing it has become harder to recover than the sin itself. The moment when the future has narrowed. I imagine Hermon holding that silence like ice holds a crack. Nothing fully broken open to the eye yet. Everything already broken in the structure. Below, the women remain daughters of men. Above, the Watchers have ceased to be merely Watchers. They have become conspirators. The distance between heaven and earth has not vanished, but it is about to be violated by will. That is the true emotional center of the chamber. The oath is the bridge of defiance. It is how desire becomes approach. It is how approach becomes taking. It is how taking becomes conception. The first births of the Nephilim are still ahead of us, but they are now advancing out of a sworn darkness, not a passing impulse. So the next chamber must leave the mountain and move toward the houses below. Because once the oath exists, the story cannot remain in the high cold air. It must go where all vows finally prove themselves into bodies, into homes, into women chosen without reverence, and brought near under a power they were never meant to endure. The oath enters human homes, and forbidden power comes frighteningly close to ordinary women. What is the human cost when power enters a household before trust? Now the story descends, and this is where we have to write with extreme care. The old account says the Watchers took wives for themselves from among all whom they chose. That sentence is brief. Its human cost is not. In a few words, the text moves from conspiracy to household invasion, from mountain oath to relational violation, from intention to human consequence. And because the line is so compressed, there is always a temptation either to sensationalize it or to glide over it too quickly. We must do neither. The only faithful way through is to keep the women human and the power imbalance visible. They chose. They took. The women are spoken of in the grammar of being acted upon, and that alone tells you how the atmosphere has changed. This is no ordinary courtship scene. No mutuality anchors it. No clean covenant makes it safe. No blessing frames the union. This is one of the reasons the title must stay person-centered. The birth of the Nephilim is not only a strange chapter in ancient literature, it is the consequence of a terrible nearness forced into human life. The old world below Hermon is not merely curious about angelic beings. It is entered by them under the sign of rebellion. That means every house in this chamber must be treated with reverence. Every doorway matters. Every woman matters. Every family frightened by what it cannot understand matters. They took wives. The phrase belongs to the ancient text itself. But emotionally, tonight, we have to hear how unlike covenant marriage it is in moral atmosphere. Formally, it resembles a human pattern. Spiritually, it is its desecration. What is taken under violated boundary does not become holy by borrowing familiar language. I always feel the severity of that, dear friend. Evil often hides inside borrowed forms. It wears the grammar of closeness while stripping closeness of consent, safety, and blessing. So let us stay very near one house. Not because the document names it. It does not. But because the human truth of the title requires a room. Perhaps there is a mother in that house who senses something has changed in her daughter before she can name what it is. Perhaps the girl herself has gone still in some new way, as if language has become difficult. Perhaps a father sees unease and mistakes it for fatigue. Perhaps sisters speak in half sentences. Perhaps the old comforts of the home still exist. The vessel, the woven mat, the low flame, the evening meal, but none of them can keep the air from feeling altered. This is the first great household sorrow of the script. A home is where power is supposed to be made gentle. A home is where strength is supposed to protect the vulnerable. A home is where closeness becomes trust over time. But here, power enters before trust. That inversion wounds the room itself. The old text does not unfold all the women's interior experiences for us. It does not tell us how many resisted, how many froze, how many could not comprehend what category of danger had crossed the threshold, how many mothers watched their daughters with helpless fear, how many nights beneath Hermon were filled with confused silence. But the compression of the text should not make the human event feel small. If anything, the brevity sharpens the ache. Whole rooms of fear stand behind a single line. And perhaps that is where this script must speak with restrained tenderness. There are moments in history when what is wrong is made harder to name, because it arrives wearing the appearance of relation. Nearness without safety. Selection without honor. Contact without blessing. The Watchers do not merely break a rule. They deform the meaning of approach. What should have remained held within holy order is brought near by force of transgressive will. That is why the next emotional layer of the title is not giantness. It is dread inside the familiar. It is the discovery that a human room can still contain a lamp, a mat, a bed, a cup, a mother, a daughter, and yet no longer feel fully sheltered. I imagine one woman lying awake after the house has gone quiet, not yet pregnant, not yet a mother of anything strange, only aware that her own body no longer feels entirely like private ground. That feeling matters. The body was meant to be lived from, not invaded. The body was meant to be part of created blessing, not the place where rebellion proves its reach. And because the story is moving toward birth, we must honor the body before the womb. We must honor the woman before the offspring. If we do not do that, the whole script becomes backward. The title is not, finally, about strange children. It is about the human women, through whom the collision becomes flesh. Banot, once more. Daughters. I return to the word, because repetition here is a kind of moral refusal. They do not cease being daughters of humankind because the Watchers choose them. They do not lose their human dignity because the text later turns toward giants and judgment. They remain women of the earth, daughters with mothers, daughters with names lost to us but not to God. And personally, I think that remembrance matters deeply in a passage like this. It keeps the story from turning cruel in the way readers handle it. There is also a household pacing to this chamber that we should not miss. First confusion, then silence, then private fear, then hiddenness, then the slow realization that what entered the room has left something behind that cannot be dismissed as passing disturbance. That pacing is vital, because it prepares us for the long human months of the next section. We are not yet at visible enlargement. We are at the threshold where the body begins carrying consequence before the community has language for what it will later call monstrous. And the community matters. Villages do not stay silent forever. Rumor begins. Attention sharpens. Women notice other women. Mothers ask questions more quietly than before. Men who cannot protect what they do not understand become restless, ashamed, angry, or bewildered. One of the painful things about this kind of crisis is that it isolates people in the very place where they most need trustworthy speech. How do you explain what has no category? How do you seek help for a violation your world has never named? How do you stand beside your daughter if even your religious imagination has no shelf for this fear? That is why this chamber must remain compassionate. The old world beneath Hermon is not equipped for what has entered it. Its people are morally real, bodily real, emotionally real, but not prepared. And vulnerability intensifies when danger arrives before the language needed to resist it. I also want to honor the older women of the houses below Hermon, because crises like this never belong only to the immediately wounded. Somewhere, an older mother sees a younger woman trying to remain composed and knows that composure is costing too much. Somewhere, an aunt folds cloth with harder hands because work is the only thing she can still control. Somewhere, sisters exchange brief looks that carry more fear than speech can manage. The whole household begins adapting itself around an unnamed fracture. Some become quieter. Some become more practical. Some keep making the meal at the ordinary hour because ordinary rhythm is the last defense against panic. That too belongs to the human cost. Forbidden nearness never harms only the person most visibly affected. It rearranges the emotional furniture of everyone who loves her and cannot remove what has entered the room. There is a reason this chamber must keep returning to trust. Trust is what makes human nearness livable. Trust lets a daughter rest in the presence of her people. Trust lets a bride imagine a future without dread. Trust lets a household sleep under one roof without fearing that power itself will become predatory. The Watchers violate more than bodies. They violate the conditions under which bodies can safely belong to one another. That is why the room changes after they enter it. The bed is still a bed. The doorway is still a doorway. The family table is still a family table. But the moral atmosphere has shifted. Familiar things become witnesses to fear. And when ordinary objects become witnesses to fear, a house begins to feel less like shelter and more like a place trying and failing to remember how shelter once felt. So, let us not hurry past the emotional realism of the line. To be chosen in this story is not to be honored. To be taken is not to be welcomed. To be brought near is not to be loved. The language itself must be rescued from false softness. And once we rescue it, the women come back into view as women, not symbols. Women who needed safety, women who deserved reverence, women whose ordinary futures were bent by a transgression initiated far above them. That recovery matters to me, dear friend, because many readers have treated this passage as though the strange offspring were the first tragedy. They were not. The first tragedy was the violation of human personhood long before the birth room ever came into sight. Some households must have tried to explain the change in smaller terms, because smaller terms are easier to survive. Fatigue, illness, mood, stress, confusion. Anything but the truth that the boundary between worlds had been crossed against them. Human beings often do this at first. We search for an explanation our existing life can hold, but some events exceed the furniture of the old explanations. The women of this story seem to stand exactly there, in the terrible interval where ordinary language still circulates. But ordinary language has already begun to fail. That failure deepens loneliness. If no word is strong enough, then every conversation feels partial, and every attempt to comfort leaves some central fear untouched. I also imagine the daughters asking themselves whether they had somehow invited what was done to them, because violated people so often search themselves for causes that belong elsewhere. The story will not let us do that. The wrongdoing begins above them, in rebellious sight and rebellious will. That must remain clear. The human heart is quick to misplace blame when the event itself is too large to bear. So this chamber has to keep restoring moral proportion. The watchers are guilty. The women are wounded. The household is destabilized. The future is darkened. But the daughters remain daughters, not causes of their own trespass. To say that plainly is one form of honoring them tonight. And perhaps there were moments of almost unbearable normality in those days. Someone still laughs unexpectedly. Someone still asks for more bread. A small child still wants to be carried. A neighbor still comments on weather. Such moments do not erase the fracture. They sharpen it. They remind the wounded household how much of life is still trying to go on while something unhealable has entered the story. That tension between continuing and breaking belongs deeply to the human cost of this chamber. The room remembers safety, but no one inside it now knows how to trust that memory. There is another sorrow here too. Once the Watchers bring their power near, the women are not only endangered in the present, they are drawn into a future. That is what makes the line, "They took wives," so heavy. It is not just a moment, it is a corridor opening. The human scene is now moving toward conception, toward gestation, toward an altered relation to time itself. The body will soon begin telling a secret the mind never agreed to carry. And so, before the next chamber opens, let us remain near one woman just a little longer. Perhaps she sits outside at dawn, because the inside of the house has become too close. Perhaps she presses a hand against her own stomach without yet understanding why. Perhaps she hears other women working and cannot bring herself to join them immediately. Perhaps her mother watches from the doorway and says nothing, because saying nothing is the only form her helpless love can take that morning. That image is worth preserving, not to sentimentalize it, to humanize it. The birth of the Nephilim begins here, in houses that no longer feel simple, in women whose bodies are moving toward an unspeakable burden, in families who sense that whatever has entered their line will not leave quietly. The next chamber must follow them into the months of carrying, because once rebellion enters flesh, time itself becomes part of the sorrow. The body has to keep living inside what the oath above the mountain decided. Pregnancy becomes silence, fear, rumor, bodily estrangement, and the slow approach of birth. How does a mother survive the months when her own body no longer feels fully familiar? Now the title enters its longest human corridor. The months of carrying. The waiting no one would have chosen. The bodily time through which rebellion becomes visible. This section has to move slowly, because pregnancy always slows a story into a sequence of days, nights, sensations, glances, questions, and inward reckonings. And in this case, the pregnancy is not cradled by ordinary hope. It is shadowed by the knowledge, or at least the growing suspicion, that what is forming inside these women does not belong wholly to the created order, as it should have remained. That is the pain of this moment. Not just conception, carrying, living with it, waking with it, trying to continue under it. A single terrible event may shock a household. Months make that shock inhabit the body. The old account is brief here too. It tells us that the women conceived and bore great giants. But between conception and birth stands the immense human territory of gestation. And your title demands that we enter it. The night heaven and earth collided is not only one night in the abstract. It remains present in the body month after month, as proof accumulates in secret, and then increasingly in sight. Nephilim. The term is layered, difficult, much discussed, and often associated with fallen ones or giants in the broad orbit of the tradition. But emotionally tonight, what matters most is that the name comes after dread, not before it. People do not begin with vocabulary. They begin with fear, anomaly, bodily evidence, and the desperate need to name what they cannot yet understand. That is why I resist making the word do all the early work. First, there are women carrying what no one can explain. Then, later, the community reaches for names strong enough to hold its terror. So let us stay first with one mother. Perhaps she wakes before dawn because her body feels too heavy for the hour. Perhaps she lies still, one hand over herself, trying to listen inwardly, and not knowing whether what she feels should be called life, burden, omen, or judgment. Perhaps she does not yet have the courage to say aloud what seems different. Perhaps she has already said it, and saying it has not made it clearer. This is where the script becomes deeply person-centered. The woman is not merely the passage through which the plot advances. She is the human being inside whom the collision is being carried. Her back aches. Her sleep alters. Food smells different. Fear comes and goes in waves. Some mornings she may try to persuade herself that what is happening will settle into ordinary motherhood. Other mornings, the body itself refuses that comfort. How lonely such months must have been. Lonely in the body. Lonely in the village. Lonely in the space between private knowing and public rumor. A woman can carry a secret even when her body has begun to speak it. That is part of the anguish here. The body becomes a testimony she cannot fully control. And around her, the household keeps trying to remain a household. Water still has to be drawn. Grain still has to be ground. Animals still have to be tended. Meals still have to be made. The sun still rises with its ordinary indifference. That contrast is emotionally sharp. Daily life continues even while one family begins to feel that the order of the world has been invaded from within. Perhaps a mother moves more slowly at the millstone. Perhaps someone reaches to help and then withdraws because no one knows how to help correctly. Perhaps eyes linger too long. Perhaps conversations stop when she enters. Perhaps compassion and fear become tangled in the same room. Adam. Humanity. I want to place this here because the pregnancy months intensify the question of what it means to be human. The daughters of men belong to Adamic life. Mortal, earth-shaped, bounded, generational, creaturely. The sorrow of this section is that humanity is not being honored in its creaturely limits. It is being used as a site of transgression. And emotionally tonight that matters because the mother's body is not the problem. Her humanity is not the problem. The problem is that rebellion has violated the frame within which human fruitfulness was meant to unfold. This is where Pastor Michael should speak softly, but with discipline. There is an ache known to many forms of human suffering, carrying something in the body that no one around you fully understands. We will not generalize that ache beyond the story. We will let it remain here, but we will not fail to notice it. The women of this passage are enduring not only fear of birth, but fear of interpretation. What will people say? What can be named? What can be hidden? What can still be hoped? What if the child itself reveals that the world is no longer as intact as it once seemed? That is a different kind of dread than immediate violence. It is slower, more domestic, more inward. It has to be survived one day at a time. I imagine one mother touching the wall as she walks, not merely for balance, but for reassurance that something in the house remains solid. I imagine another sitting with older women who speak to her carefully, searching their own memories for anything remotely comparable and finding nothing. I imagine a husband whose face has become difficult to read because his fear has made him silent. I imagine sisters trying to be tender and not knowing whether tenderness itself is enough against what has entered the family line. That last phrase matters. The family line. Because pregnancy always reaches beyond the single body into inheritance, belonging, memory, and future. A child is never only private. A child enters names, kinship, expectation, social place. So when these women carry what the old world cannot explain, the fear is not limited to one delivery. The fear touches lineage. What is being brought into the generations? What has heaven forced into earth? What will become of this child? What will become of us? That is how the months lengthen, not only through physical enlargement, through interpretive dread, through communal strain, through the slow erosion of the categories by which a people had once understood ordinary life. And still the mother has to wake each day and inhabit her own body. That is the section's most intimate burden. She cannot step outside it. She cannot hand it to another. She cannot suspend time. She can only carry. The body keeps count, even when the mind would rather not. Each week reveals more. The hidden becomes less hidden. The room changes around her. People begin adjusting their speech, their gaze, their expectations. Some may become over-careful. Some may pull away. Some may stare. Some may try to comfort prematurely. Some may keep asking questions because questions feel easier than helplessness. And there she is, still inside the center of it, having no clean answer to offer. As the body changes, time changes with it. Hours become longer because attention is always partially turned inward. Nights become heavier because sleep no longer means release from awareness. Every turn, every stirring, every new sensation becomes part of an unchosen interpretation. The mother cannot simply live ahead toward the child, as ordinary expectation might encourage. She is also living backward toward the moment of violation, and outward toward the eyes of others, and downward toward the fear that labor itself may reveal something the whole household is not ready to bear. That layering of time belongs to the intimacy of the section. Pregnancy here is not only biological duration, it is emotional weather lived continuously beneath the skin. I imagine some of the women trying to speak hope into one another because hopelessness would otherwise crush the house too early. Perhaps an elder says, "Let us wait and see." Perhaps another says, "Bodies are strange, and the Holy One still sees." Perhaps a younger sister offers water in a steadier hand than her years should yet know how to give. Small kindnesses do not remove the terror, but they make endurance possible. And in a chamber like this, endurance matters. The women are not passive scenery in the months of carrying. They are surviving. They are adapting. They are learning how to remain present in a story none of them would have agreed to enter. That quiet survival deserves reverence. There is also the sorrow of not knowing how much of the child can already be loved without fear. That may be one of the tenderest and hardest questions in the whole approach to birth. A mother's body inclines toward attachment even when her mind is troubled. She may feel movement and answer it instinctively with a hand, with tears, with wonder. with dread, with all of them at once. Human love does not always wait for clean circumstances. Sometimes it appears in the middle of terror, confused but real. That is why the chamber cannot be written as if these women felt only horror. The emotional truth is more difficult. A mother may already ache for what she is also afraid to bring into the world. By the later months, even silence would have changed texture. Early silence can still hope it is temporary. Late silence often knows it is carrying knowledge no one wants confirmed. A mother may sit among other women and feel every quiet glance as part tenderness, part fear. She may notice how conversations widen around her, how reassurance becomes more fragile, how even kindness starts sounding as though it is bracing itself. This is why the section must remain close to faces, rooms, pauses, and hands. Pregnancy here is not only inward formation, it is a whole social atmosphere learning to anticipate a birth it does not know how to welcome cleanly. Even the last preparations divide themselves. Cloth folded in care, water warmed in fear, whispered help offered by mouths that cannot name what kind of child they are preparing to receive. Not a lexical note this time so much as a human one. Waiting in Scripture can be holy, purifying, hopeful, or prayerful. But there is also a terrible kind of waiting, the waiting in which something is coming, and no one knows whether the coming should be called mercy or catastrophe. That is the waiting of this chamber. And personally, I think it is one of the saddest forms of waiting in the old tradition, because the mother cannot simply prepare with joy. She prepares under a question mark dark enough to cover the whole household. Yet because this is still Pastor Michael, still a night script, still written with relational care, we do not abandon the women to spectacle. We stay beside them. We notice how fear lives in ordinary motions. The careful lowering onto a mat, the hand against the lower back, the pauses in conversation, the attempt to keep one's face composed when someone asks whether all is well, the private moments when composure fails, the possibility that some women prayed not for greatness, not for wonder, not for the world to speak of their children, but simply for a safe end to what had already begun wrongly. That prayer belongs in the chamber. A simple prayer, not for legend, for mercy, for survivable birth, for the body not to be destroyed by what it is being made to carry, for the child, if child is even the right word, not to break the mother on the way into the world. If we do not write that possibility, the story becomes too distant. The birth of the Nephilim is frightening, precisely because it forces us to remember that every legendary offspring still had a mother. Every later tale of giantness still passed through a laboring body. Every future act of violence still first arrived as weight beneath a woman's heart. That is the moral gravity of the title. And as the months narrow, the entire world of the chamber begins leaning toward one question. What will the birth be like? That question grows heavier as the day approaches. The women around the mother know the rhythms of childbirth in ordinary times. But what do ordinary skills mean in an extraordinary corruption? What wisdom can the elder women offer when the body itself has become the site of a collision between realms? What if the signs already suggest that this labor will not belong to any pattern remembered before? I think that is where dread and compassion begin standing in the same room. The household may fear what is coming. It may also ache for the mother with a tenderness sharper than speech. Sometimes, love cannot remove the terror. It can only remain present while the terror approaches. That is what makes the chamber deeply human. Not answers, presence. A mother sits beside another mother. A hand holds another hand. A lamp is trimmed. Water is heated. Cloth is folded. No one can stop the birth now. And that is where the corridor leads. And that is why the next section must enter the birth room itself. because the months of carrying have brought us to the title's central human threshold. The first cry, the first sight, the first moment when heaven's rebellion is no longer hidden in the body, but visible in the child laid before human eyes. The first labor, the first cry, and the first moment heaven's rebellion becomes visible in a human child. What did the first cry sound like when the wound from Hermon finally entered the room as a child? Now we enter the birth room, not the mountain, not the oath, not the hidden months. The room, the body, the night in which a woman who did not ask for this burden feels labor take hold and knows that what has been feared in whispers will soon be laid in human sight. We must begin here, with those same hands. An older mother is near the lamp. A midwife is listening to the breath between pains. A husband stands outside or just beyond the threshold, because helpless love often ends up standing near doors. And at the center of it all is one mother whose body has become the last narrow gate through which rebellion must pass if it is going to appear in the world below. The title is no longer far away now. The night heaven and earth collided has come down from the mountain, moved through the household, burdened the months, and reached the moment when no one can keep the child hidden any longer. I want to keep the scene human enough that we do not lose the mother beneath the legend. She is breathing through pain, not performing a myth. Her body is working with the same ancient labor every daughter of Eve knows in some form. Tightening, opening, trembling, enduring. That matters because the story grows more terrible when ordinary human processes are forced to carry extraordinary corruption. The labor itself may still look like labor. The groan is still a groan. The sweat is still human. The hand reaching for support is still a daughter's hand. And yet everyone in the room suspects that what will arrive through this ordinary doorway of flesh will not belong to ordinary memory. Eve must be remembered here. Not because she stands physically in this room. She does not. But because every birth after Eden echoes her sentence and her dignity at once. Pain in bringing forth life. Hope in the midst of pain. Creaturely weakness joined to astonishing strength. The mothers beneath Hermon remain Eve's daughters even now. That truth protects the chamber from cruelty. We are not watching anonymous vessels. We are standing beside women who share the first mother's burden of labor. Only now with an added grief, Eve herself did not know. The fear that what is coming may carry heaven's trespass in its bones. Nephilim? The word will come later as the community tries to hold what it has seen, and scholars still dispute the full weight of its roots and associations. Some hear the echo of falling or fallen ones. Others emphasize the broad giant tradition around the term. But emotionally tonight, the crucial thing is this. The name is born from shock, not from curiosity. Human beings saw something they could not fit inside the ordinary grammar of birth, and they reached for a word heavy enough to carry collapse, strangeness, size, ruin, and dread. I always pause there, dear friend, because the first mother did not begin with a term. She began with labor. That is where the section must linger. Her labor may have started in the dark, perhaps before dawn, perhaps while the rest of the house still hoped for delay, perhaps after several false alarms that had already worn everyone thin, perhaps with the old women looking at each other in silence because there was no use pretending the time had not come. There are pains a woman expects because women before her have told their stories. There are rhythms the body learns to fear and trust at once because they belong to the old road into motherhood. But in this room, fear has an added edge. The mother does not only fear pain, she fears revelation. She fears the first sight. She fears what the faces around her will do when the hidden burden becomes visible. She fears whether anyone will still know how to speak to her once the child is seen. That may be one of the loneliest parts of the chamber. Labor is already solitary in its intensity. No one can do it for her. No one can step inside the body and carry it with her. And now the solitude is thickened by dread. Will the child live? Will she live? Will the room become witness to something no household can afterward forget? I imagine an older woman beside her. Perhaps her own mother. Perhaps an aunt who has attended many births and learned that calm hands can do holy work even when the heart is shaking. This older woman may wipe the mother's face. She may say the familiar words women say in hard labor, because familiar words are one of the last kindnesses available when the unknown grows too large. Breathe. Stay with me. Again. Hold here. Rest between. I do not want those words to become generic comfort. I want them tied to this specific room, this specific woman, this specific strain of love. The old woman cannot make the birth ordinary. She can only keep the mother from being alone inside it. And perhaps the father hears the sounds from the doorway and feels a helplessness more bitter than fear itself. Men in stories like this can too easily become scenery unless we let them remain human. He cannot enter the labor the way the women do. He cannot interpret what is coming. He may not even know whether his duty in that hour is to stay close or stay back. He may love the woman in the room and feel ashamed that love is so powerless before what the house is about to witness. He may also dread the child without wanting to. That conflict belongs in the chamber too. Human tenderness rarely arrives pure in a world this disturbed. As the labor intensifies, the room narrows. Speech becomes sparse. Every gesture matters. The lamp flame is adjusted. The water is touched. Cloth is moved closer. A hand is offered. A knee bends. A breath is counted. And all the while the whole house is leaning toward the moment after the pain. Not because they expect peace, but because uncertainty cannot remain uncertainty much longer. Mary should be remembered here as well. But by contrast, Mary bore holy mystery without violation, holy overshadowing without trespass, holy promise without corruption. Her labor belongs to redemption, not desecration. That contrast is emotionally clarifying. Not every meeting of heaven and earth wounds. In the gospel, the nearness of heaven heals. Here, in the old rebellion story, the forced nearness deforms. I think that contrast helps keep the theology clean while letting the human sorrow remain sharp. The mother beneath Hermon is not blessed with a promise she can trust. She is cornered by a result she cannot sanctify. The pains come closer now. The room knows it. The body knows it. The older women know it from the change in sound. There is often a point in labor when the mother herself feels she cannot go farther and yet is already being carried by forces stronger than preference. That threshold belongs here. She may cry out. She may fall silent. She may grip the wrist of the woman beside her hard enough to leave marks. She may shake with terror and exhaustion and the last effort of flesh opening against its own desire to close. I want to write that with restraint because bodily pain does not need embellishment. It only needs honesty. The birth of the Nephilim is frightening not because we add spectacle, but because a real woman must pass through the real gate of real pain to bring the unseen into sight. Then comes the turning, the final effort, the final push, the suspended heartbeat in the room before anyone fully speaks. This is the moment your title has been walking toward from the first section, not the theory of collision, not the doctrine of angelic rebellion, not the archive of names and gifts. The child. The visible child. The point where heaven's disorder is no longer in rumor, oath, selection, or pregnancy, but in the body laid before human eyes. That is why the room matters so much. Judgment has not yet spoken. Enoch has not yet cried aloud. The first response is not prophecy. It is faces. Who looked first? The midwife? The mother? The older woman at her shoulder? Perhaps all at once. Perhaps no one wanted to be first. I imagine silence striking the room before language does. Not long silence. Just the kind that happens when the eye meets something the mind cannot receive at once. The child is alive. The child is present. The child is not a rumor anymore. And the room understands immediately that the fear of the last months was not misplaced. Something about the child presses beyond ordinary proportion, ordinary bearing, ordinary human expectation. Perhaps it is size. Perhaps it is force. Perhaps it is the sheer, unsettling fact of presence. The way some realities enter a room and make every soul in it step back inwardly before a single word is spoken. But the mother is still the mother. That is the part I do not want to lose. Whatever else the room feels, she has just crossed through labor. She is weak, open, shaking, bleeding, looking. And perhaps what first reaches her is not theology or terror, but the raw instinct that this is the child from her own body. Human attachment can move faster than explanation. A mother may reach even while frightened. She may weep before she knows what she feels. She may want the child near and far in the same breath. She may search the face of the older women, not only for information, but for permission to remain a mother inside a moment the whole room is calling monstrous without saying so yet. That mixed ache is central to the title. If we tell the birth only as horror, we lie. If we tell it only as tenderness, we lie. It is the collision itself that wounds. Fear and attachment occupying the same heartbeat. The older woman holding the child may feel something similar. She has assisted births before. She knows the cry of a healthy infant, the silence of a weak one, the quick judgments of women who have spent their lives around bodies. But this child unsettles those memories. The cry, if there is a cry at once, may sound too forceful, too arresting, too present. Or perhaps the terror lies in a stillness before the cry, making everyone wait one extra second that feels like a lifetime. However the old storytellers imagined it, the emotional truth remains clear. This was not a birth the room could absorb into its previous understanding of life. And then the first cry. That is the chamber's human question. What did it sound like? Not because we want drama, because sound reaches the body before interpretation does. Perhaps it was not monstrous in volume. Perhaps the greater wound was that it sounded recognizably infant, and yet arrived carrying all the fear that had prepared the room for something else. Sometimes, the most troubling thing is not total otherness, but partial familiarity. A cry that should have relieved the house instead deepens the dread, because it means the impossible has entered the world through the most familiar human register of all. A baby has cried. A mother has given birth. Yet no one in the room feels that this can simply be called an ordinary child. That paradox matters deeply. The rebellion of heaven has not produced a stone, not a beast, not a symbol, but a child. A child demanding the ancient responses of cloth, touch, holding, feeding, naming, deciding. That is why this section should be read with grief rather than fascination. The room has been forced to receive something that activates human care, even while alarming human conscience. The first women in that room are not dealing with an abstract evil. They are dealing with the practical demands of a birth they do not know how to bless. I think of Joseph here too. Though, again, by contrast, Joseph received a child under confusion and fear, but the command of God steadied him. He was told not to fear taking Mary as his wife. He was given speech from heaven to quiet the trembling of earth. But the houses beneath Hermon receive no such message. No angel arrives to clarify. No dream explains the event. No name is delivered from above as mercy. There is only human sight meeting human dread. And that absence of holy explanation makes the chamber lonelier. Somebody had to lift the child. Somebody had to clean the child. Somebody had to place the child near the mother or hesitate before doing so. Somebody had to decide what the room would do next. These practical questions are what keep the story from floating off into legend. Birth always turns wonder into task. Even shock has to make room for action. The water does not stop needing to be used. The cloth does not stop needing to be folded around the body. The mother does not stop needing care. This is why the scene is so severe. Terror has entered the room, but so has obligation. Fear does not cancel the immediate work of tenderness. And maybe that is where the mother breaks. Not at the sight alone, not at the cry alone, but at the realization that she must still love from within what she cannot understand, that she must still recover from birth, still feed, still sleep if sleep can be found, still endure the village, knowing by morning. That is a very human sorrow, a sorrow of no clean category. The room may also begin already to divide. One older woman moves toward the child, another steps back. One voice says, "Wrap him." Another voice says, "Wait." One face hardens with fear. Another softens with pity for the mother. The father in the doorway may feel both pride at life and dread at its shape. This is how awe begins turning unstable. The child is extraordinary, and the room does not know whether extraordinariness is something to protect, fear, hide, or name. And the room would remember that first cry after the lamp burned low. That need to name will carry us into the next chamber, because once the child has been seen, silence can no longer be the same silence as before. Report will spread. People will ask what was born. The village will need language. The household will need language. The mother herself may need language simply to keep from drowning inside pure sensation. Beside the bed, beside the cloth, beside the spent and trembling mother, beside the women whose eyes keep returning to the child because not looking does not make the child less present. The birth has happened. The collision is no longer hidden. Heaven's rebellion has reached the human room and cried there with a living voice. The next chamber must ask what human beings do next when fear demands a name strong enough to hold it. Families and villages reach for language because terror without a name is harder to carry than terror with one. Why do human beings name what terrifies them, and what does a name allow them to endure? After the first birth comes the second labor of the story, the labor of naming. A room can survive a moment on pure shock. A household cannot survive many days that way. Sooner or later, someone must speak. Someone must tell the next woman what was seen. Someone must answer the neighbor who noticed how the house went silent. Someone must describe the child to the elders, to the fathers, to the other mothers who are themselves carrying fear in their bodies. And once words begin, the whole community starts doing what communities have always done when reality outruns habit. It searches for a term large enough to keep the world from coming apart completely. That search is more compassionate than it first sounds. We often speak as though naming is a cold intellectual act. Sometimes it is, but sometimes naming is the mind's last service to the terrified heart. If a thing can be called something, then perhaps it can be spoken about. If it can be spoken about, perhaps it can be shared. If it can be shared, perhaps one frightened house does not have to bear the full pressure alone. So when the old world began reaching for words like Nephilim, it was not merely being curious. It was trying not to go mad under the weight of the scene. I want to keep this chamber near several specific characters. The first mother, who has already seen the child and now hears others asking what kind of child it is. The older woman, who was in the room and must decide how truthfully to report what she witnessed. The father, who wishes language could restore authority to a house that no longer feels governable. And Enoch, still at a distance for now, who hears of the spreading disturbance and begins to understand that something in the generations has slipped beyond correction by ordinary means. The mother may be the first to hate certain words. Once a child is named, the name can stand between a mother and her own instinct to see only the face before her. She may not want the village term. She may recoil from hearing her child discussed as a sign, a terror, a breach, a giant, a judgment. Yet she also may need some word, any word, because private attachment alone cannot hold the public burden of what has been born. This is why naming wounds and stabilizes at once. It gives shape to fear, but it also takes the child out of the purely intimate circle of the household and places the child inside communal speech. I return to the word because this is the section where it begins to do emotional work in the mouths of others. However, one parses the philology. The name carries the weight of collapse and disturbance in the tradition around it. It sounds like something heavy enough to fall through the order of things. It sounds like a breach you cannot mend with ordinary tools. And that matters pastorally, because names are often little shelters built in storms. They do not stop the weather. They help frighten people survive its force by saying, "This is what we are facing," even if we still do not understand it fully. I imagine the first reports moving from house to house in fragments. Too large. Not like the others. Strung already. The room changed when he cried. Her face went white when she saw him. The old midwife would not speak for a long while. The words need not be exact to be effective. Fear does its own work on language. One woman tells another what she can bear to say. An elder repeats only part of it. A father adds his own hardness to conceal his fear. Children overhear what they were not meant to hear. By the time the story reaches the next village, it has already begun to gather the rough edges of legend. But legend starts in need, not in entertainment. The early tellers are not storytellers first. They are witnesses struggling to keep their footing. The older women matter greatly in this chamber. They are the keepers of birth memory. They know what is normal. They know the old measures of size, strength, cry, feeding, fever, sleep. When such women are unsettled, the community feels it. A young mother may doubt herself. An old midwife is harder to dismiss. So, imagine one such woman sitting in the courtyard after the birth, hands motionless in her lap, while another asks quietly, "What did you see?" She may answer in pieces. She may refuse certain details. She may say only, "It was not as it should have been." That sentence alone could travel far. Communities do not require full explanation to sense that order has been breached. Sometimes, one restrained witness is more persuasive than 10 dramatic ones. The father's relation to naming is different. He may want a word that restores distance. Men often reach for naming because naming makes the threat feel outlineable. If the child can be called something, perhaps the household can make rules around it. Perhaps other men can discuss it together. Perhaps control can be reassembled in speech before it is recovered in life. But some names fail in the face of too much reality. Call the child mighty, and the word sounds almost admiring. Call the child monstrous, and the word feels too easy, too detached from the fact that a woman still must hold and feed this life. Call the child a judgment, and the mother hears herself erased. So the village circles around language until a term heavy enough begins to gather acceptance. This is why names in troubled stories are rarely neutral. They are arguments, shelters, warnings, attempts at control, sometimes even prayers disguised as nouns. A people says the word over and over, partly to discover what it feels while saying it. Enoch enters this chamber by hearing. Before he becomes the lonely witness of later sections, he is still a man inside a generation where reports are multiplying. I imagine Enoch listening more carefully than the rest. not because he is colder, but because he senses that the corruption is structural, not local. One strange birth could be treated as anomaly. Many such births point upward, backward, and beyond. Enoch hears the names forming and perhaps understands that naming alone will not be enough, but naming is still necessary. Even a prophet needs the people to say what has happened before he can answer it with judgment. The mother, meanwhile, hears the word from someone else's mouth for the first time. That moment deserves gentleness. Not because the word is beautiful, because it is probably unbearable. To hear your child placed inside a term born from communal fear is a second wound after labor. She may flinch. She may go silent. She may clutch the child more tightly. She may feel relief that others finally admit the strangeness. She may hate them for admitting it. All those movements can live in one heart. And perhaps the child is still small enough in those first days that the name feels almost too large. That is another human truth. Language often outruns visible scale because it is not responding only to size. It is responding to atmosphere, force, the pressure the child exerts on the room, the memory of the birth, the whisper of what the watchers have done. A name can arise before the full evidence, because fear is already reading the future in the present. The village is not only naming what has been seen, it is naming what it suspects will follow. Shem, a name. In scripture, and in the wider ancient imagination, a name is never merely a label. It can signify vocation, memory, destiny, relation, even judgment. That is why this section needs the note. When a community names a terror, it is not simply filing information. It is negotiating how close the terror may come to the center of shared life. I always find that moving. Human beings reach for names because they are trying to remain human under pressure that would otherwise make them speechless. One father may say, "We must call them something." One mother may answer, "But do not let the name swallow the child." There is the whole tension of the section. Language protects. Language can also harden. A household needs vocabulary, but the mother fears what vocabulary will do once the child's humanity is discussed, mainly through dread. That is why this chamber must refuse easy resolution. The name helps the village speak, yet every time it is spoken, the distance between the mother's breast and the public gaze grows wider. The child becomes a category before the mother has finished being a mother to him. I think this is where some listeners will recognize another quiet human ache. The ache of watching private sorrow become public description. Again, we leave that ache inside the story. We do not turn outward, but we do honor it. The first mother is living inside a reality others are beginning to define for her. They may not mean cruelty. They may simply be afraid. Still, to be spoken about before you have found your own speech is a lonely kind of pain. The village must also decide how the name will function. Is it whispered? Spoken openly? Used only among elders? Taught to the children or hidden from them? Does it mark the child off from the beginning? Or does the household resist it until growth makes denial impossible? These practical questions matter because names create social pathways. Once a word exists, people begin arranging their behavior around it. Mothers hold their own children a little closer. Men speak in lower voices. Older women compare what they are seeing with what they have never seen before. Expectant mothers feel dread rise inside their own bodies. Language changes the weather of a community, and still the word Nephilim, or whatever earlier rough form of it first circulated, remains an attempt rather than an answer. It holds shock. It does not heal shock. It protects speech from collapse. It does not restore innocence. This is why the section should end with firmness rather than comfort. Naming is necessary, but naming cannot save the generation from what has already entered it. Enoch, hearing the spread of such names, begins to perceive that the crisis is not only biological or social, it is theological, moral, cosmic, and household level all at once. The people are doing the human thing, naming. Soon he will have to do the prophetic thing, witness. But first the names must settle over the villages like a weather front. First mothers must hear them. First fathers must repeat them. First children must notice that certain houses are being spoken of differently. That is how fear becomes history. There is also the burden carried by the next pregnant women in the village. Once a name begins circulating, every movement in their own bodies becomes shadowed by it. One woman feels a kick and goes cold instead of smiling. Another counts the weeks, with a mind split between hope and dread. Another listens to old women talk and hears in their careful pauses that no one trusts ordinary outcomes anymore. In that way, the name does more than describe what has already happened. It enters the imagination of those who have not yet delivered and changes how they carry themselves through each passing day. Fear becomes anticipatory, and anticipation is one of the ways a whole generation starts living under a single word. Names also shape memory forward. Once the elders have a term, every later report starts attaching itself to it, like cloth catching on a thorn. A second difficult birth is no longer only a second difficult birth. It becomes another Nephilim birth. A strange appetite is no longer an isolated household problem. It becomes what these named children do. The village mind begins grouping events, and grouped events quickly become destiny. That is one reason naming feels so grave in ancient worlds. The word does not merely follow reality. It starts arranging reality into a pattern people believe they can see. I imagine Enoch hearing the name and refusing to treat it as folklore. Another man might have repeated it with fascination. Enoch likely repeated it with sorrow. He would have heard in the people's speech not only fear, but exhaustion. A generation was trying to hold a breach in creation by means of shared vocabulary. That is a noble instinct in its way, but also a sign that the wound has become too large for private endurance. And once a name settles, silence changes too. People are no longer mute from ignorance. They are quiet, because the danger can now be spoken and shared. In the mouth of the community, a name has been found, or at least a fearful term has begun to gather force. It is not a clean solution. It is a trembling handle on an intolerable reality. The next chamber must ask, what happens after naming? When the child remains in the house, when milk must still be given, when sleep must still be attempted, and when tenderness itself is forced to live under a weight it does not know how to carry. Mothers, fathers, grandparents, and siblings try to keep loving inside homes that have become afraid of what they are raising. What happens to tenderness when the child in your arms also feels like a sign that the whole world has changed? Now we stay with the houses. Not only the first birth, not only the first name, the days after, the feeding, lifting, watching, whispering days. The story can too easily leap from birth to later violence and miss the painful middle where families still try to live. But the title promise you are building asks for the human room, and the human room after birth is where tenderness becomes most strained. A mother still rises in the night. A child still cries to be held. A household still arranges itself around sleep, food, exhaustion, and care. The terror of the Nephilim tradition becomes especially sharp here because it does not erase those ordinary patterns. It distorts them. Let us begin with the mother again. Her body is recovering. Her milk may come in. Her strength may not. She is still sore, still tired, still emotionally raw from labor. And now she has a child whose very presence causes everyone around her to watch differently. The most honest thing we can say is that she probably does not feel one thing only. She may feel fierce protection when others stare. She may feel alarm when the child's strength seems wrong, even in infancy. She may resent the fearful voices in the courtyard. She may share their fear in secret. She may study the child's face while he sleeps and search for what is human, what is beloved, what is hers, what is not. That searching is part of the section's holiness. Human love keeps trying to find a place to stand even when the ground has shifted. Gibborim. The old tradition often connects the offspring with giant and mighty figures. The Gibborim, the strong ones, the men of renown in the later scriptural orbit. But emotionally tonight the word matters because strength is not automatically safety. A child may impress a village and still frighten a mother. Greatness without gentleness becomes a burden long before it becomes a public menace. I slow down over that because families often feel danger before societies call it danger. The father's tenderness is strained in a different direction. He may want to protect the household from gossip. He may also want to protect the village from the child. Those two instincts can tear a man in half. If he draws near, he feels the pressure of responsibility. If he draws back, he feels shame for withdrawing from his own house. He may try to speak in practical tones because practicality is easier than grief. We will manage. We will watch. We will tell no one more than they need to know. Yet beneath those sentences may sit the heavier one he cannot say. I do not know how to be father to this. Grandmothers matter here too. Older women often keep a house from collapsing when younger parents are overwhelmed. One grandmother may keep preparing food so the mother continues to eat. Another may take the child for a few moments and hand him back too quickly. Another may remain the only person who can still look at both mother and child without visible recoil. These women are often the quiet architecture of endurance. If we leave them out, the house becomes less human than it was. And siblings, if there are siblings, make the scene even more piercing. A small child in the house does not understand theology. He only knows whether his mother looks tired, whether the grown faces around him are tense, whether the new baby draws fear instead of delight. Children feel weather quickly. They sense what adults try to hide. So one older brother may approach the child with curiosity and get pulled away more sharply than he understands. One little sister may ask why no one smiles the way they usually do when babies come. Questions like that can make a whole room grieve without answering. The household rhythm itself changes. Voices lower. Doors are watched more carefully. Visitors are fewer or more selective. The child's cries are listened to with a different sort of alertness. Every sign of unusual growth or strength is discussed after the fact in fragments. The mother cannot even rest inside routine because routine has become the place where the strangeness keeps announcing itself. I imagine one evening in such a house. The lamp is low. The mother is feeding the child. The grandmother is mending something or pretending to mend so that her hands have a task. The father is seated but not settled. No one is talking much. The child makes one sudden movement, stronger than expected, and the silence in the room tightens. Nothing violent has happened, nothing dramatic. But everyone now knows again that ordinary categories will not hold. That sort of repeated small confirmation wears families down. Terror does not only live in spectacular moments, it lives in accumulated recognitions. Jesus should be remembered here by holy contrast once more. He entered houses and made fear recede. Mothers brought children to him and were not sorry they did. His strength made the weak safe. These children beneath Hermon reverse that comfort. Their strength threatens the very tenderness children are supposed to invite. That contrast clarifies the emotional wound of the section. When a child's power begins to unsettle instead of gladden, the grammar of the home itself is being broken. The mother may also feel guilt for her own fear. That is a very human sorrow. She loves, therefore she expects herself to feel only warmth. But she does not. She feels caution. She feels dread. She feels watchfulness. She feels moments of wishing for distance and then hating herself for wishing it. No clean sentence can hold that mixture. That is why this section must be compassionate. One of the hardest burdens in any house is the burden of loving what also frightens you. A mother may nurse with tears in her eyes and not fully know whether the tears belong to tenderness, grief, exhaustion, or terror. A father may watch from across the room and feel the stab of protectiveness without knowing whom he is protecting from whom. The grandmother may pray for the child and for the house in the same breath because she cannot separate the two needs anymore. This is not a household that has ceased to care. It is a household caring under unnatural weight. There is also the social burden of comparison. Other babies are born. Other mothers hold ordinary children. Their houses sound different. The difference becomes impossible not to notice. Women talk at the well. Men talk in the field. The houses with Nephilim children begin to feel exposed even when doors are shut. People do not need to accuse aloud for shame to enter a family. Mere difference, repeated and watched, can become its own pressure. The first mothers may start withdrawing not because they hate their children, but because they cannot bear the eyes of others measuring what their own hearts are already struggling to accept. And yet tenderness does not disappear. This matters intensely. The mother still wraps the child, still listens for breathing, still notices when sleep is restless, still answers cries, still lifts with the old instinct of care. That is what makes the story tragic, rather than simply monstrous. The children do not arrive in a vacuum. They arrive in homes, with habits of affection already built into them. The women cannot just switch off the responses that motherhood awakens. Fear enters those responses. It does not erase them. I place Adam here because every house in this section is still an Adamic house. Dust-born, laboring, bounded, tender in creaturely ways, dependent on bread, sleep, and mercy. That matters emotionally because the households are not mythic structures. They are descendants of the first man, trying to keep domestic life intact under a burden too heavy for Adamic strength. I feel that sharply. The houses are ordinary enough to break. Perhaps one mother sings anyway, quietly. Not because she is unworried, because song is one of the few ways the heart keeps from hardening completely. Perhaps another cannot sing at all, and the grandmother sings in her place. Perhaps one father carves something with restless hands because idle fear is worse than active fear. Perhaps another father spends longer away from the house than he used to and hates himself for the relief of distance. These are the small human movements that keep the section honest. Households do not collapse all at once. They adapt, hide, compensate, pray, whisper, resent, protect, and continue. The child, meanwhile, keeps growing. That is the weight beneath every domestic scene. Milk is not stopping growth. Blankets are not containing growth. Household love is not redirecting growth. Time itself is carrying the family toward a later fear. And because time is doing that work, the house begins to live in anticipation. Every new day brings fresh evidence that the child will not remain manageable. A mother may feel this first in her own arms, in the unexpected weight, in the force of movement, in the sense that infancy itself is already too small a word for what she is holding. A father may feel it when the child exerts force that no ordinary child should possess. A grandmother may feel it simply by recognizing that no amount of ordinary wisdom is narrowing the strangeness. This is how tenderness becomes burdened. Not false, burdened. Love keeps showing up, and just has to show up through fear. That is a kind of grief, all its own. And there may be moments of almost unbearable sweetness, precisely because they cannot last. The child sleeps. The mother sees the face in stillness and feels only love for 3 breaths. The grandmother touches the child's hair and remembers what ordinary hope used to feel like. The father catches himself smiling at some simple gesture and then stiffens, ashamed of relief. These fleeting moments matter because they reveal what has been stolen. The house still has the capacity for ordinary affection, but the future keeps interrupting it. Enoch, hearing how the households are straining, would have understood something that later readers often miss. The earliest evidence of corruption is not always public bloodshed. Sometimes it is the sigh in a mother's chest before she lifts the child again. Sometimes it is the way a father no longer knows whether his own house is a refuge. Sometimes it is the older women speaking more softly because their wisdom has reached its edge. When domestic life loses its ordinary confidence, the moral order of a people is already in deeper trouble than the fields alone can show. There is another domestic sorrow here. A mother cannot grieve openly without risking how others will hear the grief. If she speaks too tenderly, people may think she is blind to the danger. If she speaks too fearfully, they may think she has denied her own child. So she learns the exhausting middle of measured speech, the careful sentence, the incomplete confession, the face that reveals enough to be honest and hides enough to survive. Such discipline wears down the soul, even before public disaster begins. The grandmothers also carry memory differently. They remember ordinary sons becoming men who could plow, build, bless a table, bury a father with honor, and protect a younger sister on the road. Because they remember those old patterns, they feel the rupture more acutely. This is not simply unusual growth. It is growth detached from the old promises of human usefulness. Their grief is therefore twofold: pity for the mothers before them, and mourning for the simple future they now know these households may never reach. Even the house itself seems to notice. Benches scrape more sharply, doors shut more carefully, night sounds carry farther. A family under strain begins hearing every ordinary noise as if it might reveal how near fear has come and how much shelter remains. Sooner or later, the households speak the same quiet sentence in different forms. We cannot keep carrying this as though it were only a family matter. That recognition does not mean the families stop loving. It means the fear has become social and historical. What began in one room has become a weight on many rooms. And once that happens, the story begins leaning toward public consequence. The mother is there. The father is there. The grandmother is there. The child is there. Nothing openly catastrophic has happened in that single moment. Yet the whole room feels that something immense is pressing against the limits of household tenderness. The next chamber must follow that pressure into growth itself, because the children will not remain within the scale where family love alone can keep calling them simply children. The children grow beyond the scale of ordinary life, and households become the first places to realize that greatness without holiness becomes devouring. When does what once inspired awe become a danger that even love cannot manage? Growth changes every story. In ordinary houses, growth is usually mercy. A child gains strength, learns speech, fills out, walks farther, carries more. The signs of enlargement gladden a family because they promise life. But in this chamber, growth darkens the room. Each increase in size, appetite, force, and presence pushes the children farther beyond the scale where the household can still pretend the crisis is temporary. The very thing that might once have inspired wonder now begins turning awe into fear. This transition must be handled carefully. The mothers do not wake one morning and simply stop seeing their offspring as their own. That is not human. But they do begin learning that love cannot make power harmless. A mother may still remember the first swaddling. She may still know the shape of the child's early cry. Yet now she also sees hands too strong, movements too forceful, hunger too difficult to satisfy, moods that change the house when they change. This is how dread matures, not through rumor now, but through repeated, undeniable experience. Azazel. The tradition remembers Azazel as a chief corrupter who taught forbidden arts, weapons, adornments, and the misuse of created things. He matters in this section because the growing children are not appearing in a morally neutral environment. The world around them has already been sharpened toward violence, pride, and excess. Great size alone is frightening enough. Great size in a culture instructed by corruption becomes catastrophic. I always think that is one of the coldest details in the larger Watcher's world. The offspring are born into an earth already being trained how to receive them badly. So let us begin again at the household level. One mother watches her child eat and realizes ordinary provision no longer matches ordinary need. One father carries in more food and feels the humiliation of insufficiency. One grandmother sees how quickly stores disappear and understands before anyone speaks that private strain will soon become communal strain. This is where greatness first feels dangerous in appetite. Not yet in battle. Not yet in open bloodshed. In the table. In the store jar. In the flock reduced faster than wisdom can explain. Hunger is one of the most domestic forms of fear. A village can endure stories for a while. It cannot endure consumption without limit. When the children's need begins pressing against the ordinary means of life, everyone feels it. The mother feels it in the anxiety of feeding. The father feels it in the failure of labor to keep pace. The community feels it in the thinning margin between enough and not enough. That is how the great corruption starts leaving the birth room and entering the economics of daily survival. And size changes tenderness too. A child once held easily now requires caution. A quick movement, once cute, now startles the room. The playful exertion of strength no longer feels innocent because the imbalance between intent and effect has widened. Perhaps one smaller sibling is knocked aside without malice. Perhaps a doorway is broken. Perhaps a vessel is shattered in one careless turn. Perhaps the mother's own wrist aches after trying to restrain what she can no longer restrain. These moments matter because fear often becomes certain through accumulation rather than spectacle. The father may respond by becoming harder. He raises his voice sooner, sets more rules, attempts control through command. But command is only as strong as the order beneath it. And this house is already living downstream from cosmic disorder. So he discovers, perhaps with dread, that authority itself is thinning. A father can discipline a child within human measure. What does he do when the child exceeds the frame in which fatherhood has usually operated? That helplessness is humiliating. It can make men harsh. It can make them silent. It can make them leave. None of those responses heal the house. Enoch becomes more important in this chamber because households are now experiencing what prophets later interpret. I imagine reports reaching him not only of size, but of appetite, domination, injury, and the strange moral atmosphere gathering around the giant offspring. Enoch is not merely hearing that unusual children exist. He is hearing that creation is beginning to groan under them. That distinction matters. Greatness could still have been narrated as marvel. Hunger changes marvel into menace. The mothers often perceive this turning first, not because they are wiser in every abstract way, because they live nearest the daily cost. They know when feeding becomes dread. They know when touch requires vigilance. They know when the room no longer relaxes around the child's presence. A mother may even grieve the loss of her own earlier awe. At first, the child's extraordinariness may have stunned her into a fearful kind of wonder. Now, wonder decays. What remains is management, watching, guarding others, bracing for what the day may demand. That is one of the saddest transitions in the entire script. the moment when amazement ceases to be sustainable and is replaced by fear sharpened through repetition. Gibborim once more, mighty ones. The word can sound heroic in some settings, but here it must be heard with caution. Might without submission to the good is only scale added to corruption. Emotional relevance matters more than lexical elegance tonight. Families were not asking for mighty ones. They were asking for children they could raise in peace. When power outruns peace, the old admiration attached to greatness begins to sour. The village now joins the household in full awareness. Fields are affected. Stores are affected. Animal life is affected. Ordinary men begin speaking of the offspring not as odd children, but as a force. That shift in language is crucial. A force is something people organize around, fear collectively, and eventually resist or flee. Once the offspring become a force, the era of hidden domestic sorrow gives way to public destabilization. But it is important that we remember where this realization began. It began with mothers who could not soothe enough, fathers who could not provide enough, and houses where love had already learned its own insufficiency. The children themselves, now growing into terrifying prominence, may not even understand the meaning of moderation because their origin was never moderated by holiness. That is a chilling thought. Appetite without formed reverence can only expand. Strength without a rightful teacher can only test itself. And the earth, already tutored by Azazel in violence and misuse, offers no healthy frame strong enough to absorb such beings. What follows is almost inevitable. Greatness seeks more room than the world can safely give it. Perhaps one mother watches her grown son from a distance and remembers his first cry. That memory would hurt. She remembers the cloth, the bed, the older women, her own body broken open to bring him forth. And now she sees him as the village sees him, too large, too hungry, too forceful, too near the edge of becoming a terror no one can contain. That mother is one of the great hidden griefs of the story. She loved before she understood. She kept loving after fear entered. And now she must live long enough to watch love fail as a strategy for governing what rebellion brought into the world through her body. That is not her guilt, but it is her sorrow. The fathers bear their own version of this sorrow. They may have tried rules, labor, instruction, distance, threats. They may have hoped that growth would settle into usefulness. Instead, growth has begun to consume the frame of usefulness itself. A strong son is a joy in ordinary life. A son whose hunger drains the house and whose might unsettles the village becomes a judgment on ordinary categories. The father realizes not only that he cannot fully guide the child, he realizes the whole social imagination of his people has no settled place for such strength. That is what turns private concern into communal fear. And fear, once communal, starts teaching its own habits. People avoid certain paths, speak in lower tones, keep children closer, measure food more anxiously, interpret every disturbance through the lens of the growing offspring. Soon the entire world feels tilted around their presence. This is how awe turns into history. Not one gasp, but 1,000 adjustments. The elders of the village may try to speak of solutions, but the mere fact that solutions are being discussed tells you the old innocence is gone. No one discusses solutions to ordinary children. They discuss guidance, training, inheritance, marriage, work. Solutions belong to crises. Once the offspring are treated as a crisis, the story has crossed a threshold it cannot recross. There is another step in the turning from awe to fear, and it happens in the village imagination before it is fully codified in law or punishment. People begin revising their hopes downward. Mothers stop asking whether these children might become useful and begin asking only whether the next day can pass without injury. Fathers stop dreaming of inheritance and start calculating containment. Grandmothers stop comparing the offspring to strong boys of earlier generations because comparison has become absurd. Even the elders, who once may have hoped to interpret the matter within old precedents, begin to admit that no precedent is holding. This shrinking of hope is itself a judgment on the age. A society is already being eaten when it no longer expects peace from its own rising generation. And hunger, once normalized, teaches cruelty by repetition. A child who is always indulged by excess comes to believe the world exists for devouring. A village that keeps surrendering its stores without resolution becomes weaker in body and will. The mothers see this first because feeding is intimate. They watch appetite widen without gratitude. They feel the pull between pity and alarm each time provision disappears faster than love can justify. The fathers see it next in the fields, in the vanished animals, in the arithmetic of labor that no longer ends in enough. Then the entire settlement begins to feel the truth at once. These mighty children are not merely difficult members of the community. They are becoming a principle of consumption inside it. That is why the later violence, when it comes, should never be treated as if it fell from a clear sky. Violence has roots. Its roots are often fed at tables, in unchecked appetites, in the slow training of a will to expect more than the world can rightly give. Azazel's corrupted gifts and the giant offspring belong together here. One corrupts desire by teaching the misuse of created things. The other magnifies desire until the whole earth begins staggering under it. When those two currents meet, households feel the collision first, but cities and fields will soon feel it too. Enoch is therefore not stepping into a merely strange age. He is stepping into an age where appetite has become moral weather. Another sign of danger appears when the village starts adjusting its moral language around the offspring. At first, people say unusual, mighty, difficult, strange. Later, they say unsafe, consuming, impossible, too much. That movement in description matters because societies often tell the truth slowly. They circle it first. They test partial words. They hope a softer term will suffice. But repeated harm hardens speech. Once a people begins speaking with stripped-down honesty, the crisis is already advanced. The offspring have not changed only in size by this point. They have changed the courage level required for anyone to speak accurately about them. This is why cannot end merely with bigger bodies and larger meals. The real horror is moral. Appetite is training a generation to accept disproportion as normal. Parents are learning to lower expectations from peace to survival. Villages are learning to organize around threat instead of flourishing. And the offspring themselves are growing in a world where no faithful boundary has been able to form them gently. That is the atmosphere into which Enoch must speak. He is not entering a curious chapter of family history. He is entering a civilization whose center of gravity is already bending toward judgment. Soon the strongest mothers stop asking whether all can be preserved and begin asking whether anyone can still be spared. That is the final turn of the chamber. Wonder once stood at the cradle. Now watchfulness stands at every gate. The village has learned that size without holiness does not enlarge life. It reduces it until even ordinary hope feels too fragile to speak aloud in daylight. Enoch, hearing and seeing these things, becomes the necessary figure for what comes next. Until now, the story has stayed close to the human rooms. It has done so on purpose, but public corruption is widening. The mighty children are not remaining children. The earth itself is being taught new forms of fear. Hunger has become excess. Excess is leaning toward violence. The houses can no longer contain what they first absorbed in silence. Not yet the flood. Not yet the full judgment. Not yet the sleep transition. Only the recognition that greatness without holiness devours the very world that first tried to cradle it. So picture one final scene. A mother stands at the edge of the yard at evening. The grown son is beyond her now, not in age alone, but in scale, appetite, and presence. The father is near, but not near enough. The village is still functioning, but only just. The grandmother has gone quiet in a way that means she has no more inherited wisdom to offer. And in the distance, a righteous man like Enoch begins to understand that witness must now rise where households have already been overwhelmed. That is where we leave this chamber. The next section must follow the lonely witness, because the homes beneath Hermon have carried the burden as long as homes could carry it. And now history itself is beginning to ask for judgment. One righteous man begins to hear the sorrow of the houses and realizes the age is too wounded for private endurance. What does it feel like to be the man who understands that the grief inside ordinary homes is now large enough to summon judgment? Now, the story turns toward Enoch. Not away from the mothers, not away from the houses, toward the man who begins to understand what the houses mean. That distinction matters. We are not leaving the human room because the human room no longer matters. We are following the sorrow from the room into the conscience of the one who can no longer pretend the sorrow is local. Enoch becomes necessary precisely because he does not despise the domestic grief. He hears it, he receives it. He lets the burden of the households become the burden of witness. That is what makes him lonely. Not that he knows strange things, that he knows what the strange things are doing to ordinary people. A man can become famous in later retellings for visions, journeys, and mysteries. But before all that settles around him, I want to keep Enoch human tonight. He is a son in a line of sons. He walks the same earth Adam walked after exile. He belongs to a generation in which fields still need tending, children still need raising, and old people still need burying. He is not floating above the human condition. He is standing inside it while seeing farther into its ruin than most can bear to see. That is why his section must begin on the ground. Perhaps he hears the reports first, not in some grand revelation, but in fragments from tired mouths. A father who has run out of explanations. An older woman whose birth wisdom has finally broken against what she has seen. A mother who speaks carefully, because if she speaks too plainly, she will collapse. A village elder who no longer trusts the old categories. This is how witness begins. Not always with lightning, sometimes with accumulation. Enoch listens to enough grief that the shape behind the grief becomes visible. And once it becomes visible, sleep itself may begin to change for him. A righteous man does not hear such things and remain light in spirit. He feels the drag of them. He feels the moral coldness moving through the age. He notices that the strong have ceased to protect, that households are learning fear instead of peace, that the offspring of rebellion are not remaining a private strangeness, but are becoming a pattern of devouring inside the land. The age is changing its smell, its sound, its burden. Enoch senses that. The wise often feel history growing heavier before history names its own weight. Enoch. His name is often connected with dedication, instruction, or consecrated beginning. And emotionally tonight that matters because Enoch is the man set apart not for distance from pain, but for clearer nearness to it. He is not dedicated to abstraction. He is dedicated inside a generation that has become hard to inhabit cleanly. When I think of Enoch here, dear friend, I do not first imagine a triumphant visionary. I imagine a man whose dedication has made him unable to look away when others still can. That inability to look away is a wound of its own. He may see the mothers differently than the village gossips do. He may hear the fathers differently than the fearful elders do. He may understand that what is happening is not the fault of the houses, even though the houses are where the burden has become visible. This is the secondary vulnerability break the whole script has been preparing for. Section 9. Let us feel the mother's sorrow. Section 11 lets us feel what it means for one righteous human being to receive that sorrow into himself until it becomes a calling. There is a special loneliness in being the one who cannot reduce the age to manageable terms. Others can still call the giants impressive, dangerous, useful, mighty, cursed, unusual. Enoch sees that all those smaller labels are orbiting a deeper catastrophe. The order between heaven and earth has been violated, and the common life of human beings is paying for it. Perhaps he walks at evening beneath a sky that no longer feels only beautiful. Perhaps Hermon is visible in the distance, not merely as a mountain, but as a memory in stone. Perhaps he passes homes where the lamps are lit and knows that behind one of those walls, a mother is trying to love without lying, or a father is trying to govern what exceeds governance, or an older woman is silently admitting that the wisdom of ordinary life is no longer enough. That is the loneliness of Enoch. He is not lonely because he prefers heights. He is lonely because the truth has become too large for easy company. A righteous person often loses the shelter of simplification before anyone else does. I think Enoch would have remembered Adam in this section, not Adam as distant ancestor only. Adam as the first man who learned what it means for one choice to bruise generations after it. Adam knew the ground could change because of sin. Enoch now sees the households changing because of another rebellion, one that has crossed the border between realms and entered flesh in an even stranger form. The line from Adam to Enoch is therefore not merely genealogical. It is emotional. Both men stand in worlds altered by disobedience. Both must keep speaking of God in places where the consequences of rebellion have become painfully material. Walking with God. The phrase attached to Enoch in Genesis is brief, but its brevity is a mercy. It leaves room for depth. To walk with God is not to skip above history. It is to remain in step with the Holy One while the age around you loses its rhythm. That is why the phrase matters emotionally here. Enoch's nearness to God does not make him less tender toward human sorrow. It makes him more able to feel how badly the human world needs truth. A man walking with God cannot agree to call devouring greatness merely impressive. He cannot baptize corruption with the language of wonder. He must keep moral sight clean, and that moral sight is expensive. If Enoch hears men speaking admiringly of giant strength, he must resist them. If he hears mothers blaming themselves for the terror forced upon their houses, he must not let that lie settle. If he hears elders trying to absorb the age's disorder into manageable custom, he must remain unpersuaded. The witness is lonely because it is faithful. The faithful often sounds severe simply because the age has become practiced at euphemism. I imagine one conversation between Enoch and a father from one of the stricken houses. The father is tired, too tired for grand speeches. He may not ask for prophecy. He may ask only whether God sees, whether God knows what has happened in his house, whether heaven is still heaven when heaven's rebels have entered earth this way. That is a human question, not a philosophical one. And Enoch, if he is the man this tradition remembers, does not answer with coldness. He answers with steadiness. He does not deny the horror. He does not flatter despair. He receives the question as something holy in its own wounded way. Then he carries it upward inside prayer, grief, and eventually proclamation. This is why must not turn Enoch into a machine for revelations. He is first a receiver of human anguish. He becomes a prophet because he has been truthful about sorrow, not because he has bypassed it. The houses have already taught him how severe the age has become. By the time he speaks against the Watchers, he is not protecting a theory. He is protecting the violated moral reality of mothers, fathers, children, and ordinary homes. There is also the ache of being misunderstood. A generation living inside corruption rarely welcomes the witness who names it cleanly. Some may treat Enoch as too grave, others as too certain, others as not practical enough. Others may secretly want him to make the whole thing simpler than it is. But the task of witness is not simplification. It is truthful proportion. That is one reason I find him so moving here. He has to remain gentle with the wounded and unyielding toward the rebellion that wounded them. Many people can do one of those things. Few can do both. Enoch's nights may therefore be crowded with the age. He thinks of the mothers. He thinks of the children growing beyond measure. He thinks of the villages lowering their expectations from peace to survival. He thinks of Hermon and the oath and the old breach between realms. He thinks of God's holiness, not as an abstract perfection, but as the last clean truth left in a world filling with mixture. This is why his sorrow is disciplined rather than diffuse. He is not merely sad because things are bad. He is burdened because he can see the pattern whole enough to know where it leads if God does not intervene. The mothers may not yet know his name as central. The fathers may not yet know what he will say. The giants certainly do not care what a righteous man perceives. But heaven is already bending toward witness in him. That is the significance of the chamber. A whole generation can be slipping, and still God raises one human being who refuses to call the slipping normal. I think this is where the deepest tenderness of Enoch appears. He does not become a witness by hardening against people. He becomes a witness because he refuses to harden against them. He lets their grief reach him. He lets the household sorrow remain household sorrow, instead of reducing it to data in a cosmic drama. The righteous are often those who can still feel the full human cost of evil after others have learned to speak of it impersonally. And that is why he must soon speak, because to know truly and stay silent would be its own betrayal. Yet before he speaks, let us pause beside him one moment longer. He is walking. The light is lowering. The land is beautiful. In the outward way, land can remain beautiful, even while history beneath it is going wrong. He hears distant sounds from village life. A dog. A child. A vessel set down. A woman calling someone inside. And he knows that behind such ordinary sounds, the age has become morally unbearable. That contrast is the burden he carries. The world is still creaturely enough to love. It is becoming corrupted enough to judge. Holding those two truths at once is the loneliness of the righteous witness. There may also have been moments when Enoch had to kneel, simply because standing inside the age felt too heavy. Not mystical collapse. Plain human prayer. A man on the ground, naming before God what the villages could no longer carry in speech alone. The mothers, the fathers, the children growing past measure, the blood entering the land, the strange fatigue spreading through ordinary life. Prayer in such an age is not decorative. It is how a righteous man refuses to let corruption have the final word in his own soul. He returns the burden upward, not because he is free of it, but because he knows burden becomes despair when it is carried without reference to the Holy One. And perhaps some evenings, he said, almost nothing at all. Perhaps he only stayed under the dark a little longer, letting the names of the houses move through him slowly. That, too, is part of faithful witness. Not every true response is a speech. Sometimes truth begins as refusal to become numb, refusal to let repeated sorrow turn into a dull background hum. Enoch's tenderness may have looked like steadiness from the outside, but inside that steadiness, there was likely grief disciplined into prayer, grief disciplined into attention, grief disciplined into the kind of endurance only God can keep from hardening. He knew tenderness alone could not mend the age, yet truth without tenderness would only deepen the wound. So he kept both together, the clear eye and the unhardening heart, the severe word and the grieving love beneath it. That balance is one of the holiest burdens in the story, and one of the loneliest burdens any witness can bear before God and men for the broken homes beneath him that night. The next chamber must widen the frame from the witness to the world itself, because the land is no longer merely hosting strange families. It is beginning to groan under blood, appetite, violence, and the multiplied consequence of what heaven's rebellion has brought into earth. Household sorrow becomes public violence, and the ground itself begins to feel overfilled with what human strength cannot cleanse. What does it feel like when an age has become so heavy that even the earth seems to be asking God to answer it? No corruption stays indoors forever. That is one of the cold truths this story has been approaching from the beginning. What begins in forbidden sight enters the house. What enters the house burdens the generations. What burdens the generations eventually spills into the land. And once it spills into the land, the earth itself begins to feel less like a floor under life and more like a witness under strain. That is where we have come now. The households were the first chambers of sorrow. The earth becomes the wider chamber of evidence. The old traditions around the watchers and their offspring do not keep the damage at the scale of unusual birth. They move relentlessly toward appetite, devouring, bloodshed, and the undoing of ordinary human peace. Greatness without holiness does not remain grand. It becomes predatory. The giant offspring consume what normal life needs. The people suffer. Then, the violence widens still farther. The age begins teaching itself to call excess normal. Once that happens, the ground carries more than footsteps, seed, and rain. It carries the results of unrestrained strength. Enoch sees that, but he is not the only one. The mothers see it when the roads become less safe. The fathers see it when labor no longer secures enough for the house. The elders see it when counsel sounds thin against the new scale of harm. The children see it in the changed faces of grown people. Even the animals may seem to feel it, because violence changes the behavior of a whole place. A valley under fear does not sound like a valley at peace. This is one of the reasons the section must stay sensory, not merely declarative. A world in corruption becomes exhausting to inhabit. The body never fully unguards. The village listens differently. Food is handled differently. Distances are measured differently. Travel after dusk is considered differently. One no longer lives in a land. One lives in a land under pressure. Adama. The old biblical imagination never treats the ground as morally irrelevant. Adam came from it. Abel's blood cried from it. Human labor depends on it. Burial returns bodies to it. The earth in Scripture is not a neutral platform. It is bound to human obedience and human ruin in intimate ways. That is why the note matters emotionally tonight. When an age becomes violent enough, the earth feels like it has been made to carry more than it was meant to carry. I always find that sobering. The ground under our feet is not indifferent in the biblical world. It remembers. Abel should be remembered here. His blood cried from the ground long before the Watcher's age reached its later violence. That earlier cry becomes a pattern for this one. God is not confused by blood hidden under dust. He is not deceived by power that calls itself greatness. The mothers who first held strange infants are older now. The fathers who once tried rules are diminished by futility. The grandmothers who carried memory have become near silent because the old comparisons no longer help. And the younger generation has grown up inside distortion, which means distortion is in danger of feeling ordinary to them. That is one of the gravest warnings in the chamber. Evil does not merely injure. Given time, it retrains the imagination. Children born into a world shaped by devouring may begin to think devouring is simply how power works. Villages accustomed to scarcity caused by the mighty may begin to confuse survival with peace. The earth itself becomes a teacher of sorrow because every field, path, and threshold reminds the people that life is being lived under force, violence. The old texts move toward this word with terrible inevitability. Once appetite, strength, and corruption join hands, violence is the natural child of their union. The word matters because it strips away the false romance of giantness. Violence tells the truth about greatness, divorced from holiness. It tells mothers why they are afraid, fathers why they are tired, and the earth why it groans. Personally, I think the word is merciful in its severity. Better a hard truth than a glamorous lie. The age is now loud with consequences. A house loses an animal. A field is stripped. A man goes missing. A boundary line means less than it used to. Children are hurried indoors earlier. Women walk in tighter groups. Elders speak of things they once would have dismissed as impossible. The ordinary world has not vanished, but it has become thin. That thinning is what prepares the heart for judgment. People often imagine judgment arriving out of nowhere, as if heaven grew impatient in a single moment. But judgment in stories like this arrives after long, accumulated refusal, after the land has carried more than it should carry, after the blood has cried too long, after the weak have been made to organize their whole lives around the unrestrained strong. Enoch understands this, but so do the mothers now, though perhaps in different language. A mother may not say the earth is crying out. She may say only that the world does not feel bearable anymore. A father may not say creation is groaning. He may say only that nothing stays enough. An elder may not use prophetic speech. He may say only that the old way of life is disappearing before his eyes. All of those are earthly forms of the same truth. The land can no longer keep quiet. I think Noah should begin to appear at the edge of this chamber, not yet as the central figure, but as the future implied by Enoch's witness. Enoch sees the weight. Noah will later carry the preservation. That succession matters because judgment in Scripture is never only negation. It is severe mercy, cutting away what devours so that something clean may remain. But we are not at the ark yet. We are still at the point where the earth's burden has become undeniable, and heaven's answer is beginning to gather. There is another sorrow here too. The righteous, in such an age, are often tempted to numbness. When violence becomes ordinary, people protect themselves by ceasing to feel its full cost. That is why prophetic language sounds so sharp. It wakes the numb. It forces proportion back into speech. It says, "This is not merely how the world is. This is what the world has become under rebellion." Without such speech, tired societies learn to call exhaustion realism. Enoch cannot allow that. Neither can the God who hears the ground. Perhaps Enoch stands in a field at dusk and sees the ordinary beauty of light on grain or stone or slope, and the beauty itself hurts him because it reveals what the age has done to a good creation. Beauty under corruption does not cease to be beauty. It becomes evidence for what has been violated. The earth was not made for this burden. The daughters of men were not made for this burden. The villages were not made for this burden. The giant offspring were not made to govern the land as they do, because they were never brought forth within holy order to begin with. Everything is now carrying a misfit weight. This is why the coming judgment must be heard as answer, not mood. Heaven does not intervene because it has become annoyed. Heaven intervenes because truth has been publicly contradicted by the shape of life on earth. The weak are being crushed. The land is remembering blood. The structures of daily peace are collapsing. The age itself is teaching falsehood. What else should holiness do but answer? And yet the section should end with pathos, not triumph. Judgment is necessary. It is also terrible. No righteous person delights simply in destruction. Enoch does not grin at the thought of the age being cut down. The mothers do not suddenly feel vindicated in a simple way. The fathers do not become relieved without grief. Judgment means that the wound is real enough to require a knife, and there is always sorrow in that. One of the saddest turns in a corrupted age is the way ordinary people begin budgeting their joy. They stop asking for flourishing and begin hoping only for an uneventful week. They stop planning feasts far ahead and begin measuring whether stores will last. Mothers no longer dream expansively over their children. Fathers no longer imagine straightforward inheritance. Elders no longer speak first of blessing but of precaution. This shrinking of the human horizon is itself a wound on the land. A people created for gratitude and fruitfulness slowly learns to live by defensive calculation. The earth feels that change because the earth was given as the theater of blessing, not merely the stage on which frightened creatures make emergency arrangements. And still, there would have been moments of deceptive beauty. Morning light on stone, wind over grass, the old pathways open under the feet. Such beauty does not cancel corruption. It sharpens it. It reminds the righteous that judgment is coming not upon a worthless world, but upon a world worth grieving. The land is lovely enough to mourn and burdened enough to require cleansing. That double truth is important. God's answer is severe because creation matters. The villages matter. The fields matter. The daughters of men mattered from the first evening beneath Hermon, and the ground that held their steps has mattered all the way through the story. There are seasons when a people grows so used to threat that relief itself begins to feel suspicious. That is another injury violence does to the earth. It does not merely spill blood, it trains expectation downward. Even peaceful mornings are received cautiously, because everyone is braced for interruption. The body learns watchfulness as habit. Children inherit alarm before language. The old songs of harvest sound thinner because gratitude has been crowded by vigilance. Such a land is not simply occupied by danger. It is being catechized by danger, taught to imagine the future as a corridor of likely harm rather than a field open to blessing. And yet the cry of the earth is also a strange mercy, because it means the world has not become numb in the same way human societies often do. The ground does not flatter the strong. It does not reinterpret blood as progress. It bears witness by refusing forgetfulness. That steadiness makes the coming answer feel less arbitrary. Judgment is not descending onto a silent world. It is meeting a world that has already been speaking, groaning, testifying through every strained village and every burdened field. Even the wind across fields sounded altered now, because people who no longer trusted safety had stopped hearing quiet as peace. So let the chamber close with the earth itself as witness. The same ground that once held Adam's footprint and Abel's blood now bears the multiplied consequence of the Watcher's rebellion. It bears hunger, fear, violence, and the tiredness of villages. It bears the memory of births that should never have had to become symbols of dread. It bears the footsteps of Enoch, who walks it faithfully while hearing what it has begun to say without words. The next section must therefore move into verdict. The age has been seen, the households have been heard, the earth has become evidence. Now the story must face the terrible mercy of God speaking against the rebellion and the offspring that have filled the land with a greatness that only devours. Heaven finally names the age truthfully, and Enoch bears a message severe enough to honor the sorrow of the earth. What does it feel like when judgment is no longer avoidable and truth must be spoken over everything the age tried to normalize? This is the chamber of no more pretending. The daughters were seen. The oath was sworn. The women were taken. The children were born. The houses were burdened. The villages were strained. The earth grew loud with violence. Now heaven answers. I do not want to rush that answer. If we rush it, we cheapen both mercy and judgment. Judgment here is not an interruption of the story. It is the story telling the truth at last, in a voice large enough to meet the scale of the wound. Everything before this point has been a preparation for proportion. Once God speaks against the Watchers and against the giant offspring, reality is no longer being narrated mainly by fear, gossip, admiration, exhaustion, or survival. It is being narrated by holiness. That matters for Enoch above all. The witness who has carried the grief must now carry the word. He must speak not merely what men suspect, but what God declares. That is an unbearable honor in one sense. To stand between a violated age and a holy verdict is to feel the loneliness of both compassion and truth at their sharpest point. Enoch cannot soften the message merely because he loves the people. He also cannot speak it as though people were irrelevant. The message matters because the people matter. That is what makes it prophetic rather than theatrical. Not a lexical note in the narrow sense, but a moral one. A divine verdict is God restoring proportion to a world that has lost it. That is why the word matters emotionally. The age has been speaking about itself falsely for too long, calling greatness admirable, treating appetite as inevitability, adjusting to violence as structure, letting the mothers carry a shame that was never theirs to carry. The verdict ends, that false narration. It says what the age is, and in saying it, refuses to let corruption define reality by repetition alone. The Watchers are addressed as what they are. Not romantic rebels, not tragic visionaries, not misunderstood boundary crossers. They are violators of order, teachers of corruption, agents of burden on the earth below. This is one reason the section needs firmness. Many readers have been tempted to make the Watchers interesting in a way the households beneath them would never have found interesting. The mothers did not need fascination. They needed deliverance. The fathers did not need a mythology of grandeur. They needed the devouring to stop. The earth did not need another layer of explanation. It needed God to answer the blood and violence upon it. I think Enoch must tremble in this chamber, not because the message is uncertain, because it is certain. There is a difference. Uncertainty can make a man anxious. Certainty can make him bow. To know that the Holy One has seen everything, the oath, the taking, the births, the violence, the cry of the earth, and has now rendered judgment, is to stand in a seriousness beyond rhetoric. Enoch is not composing an argument. He is transmitting a sentence. The grandeur of that does not make him less human. It makes him more aware of how little human beings can manage when holiness decides to speak directly into history. The sons of the Watchers, the mighty offspring, are also named truthfully now. Their scale does not save them. Their renown does not save them. Their force does not save them. Greatness without righteousness is still judged as corruption. That should cleanse the imagination of every age. There is always a temptation to bow before large things simply because they are large, feared things because they are feared, successful things because they are successful. But the verdict of God cuts through scale. It asks not how impressive something is, but whether it is good. The giant sons failed that test catastrophically. And here, perhaps, Enoch remembers the mothers again. He has to, otherwise the verdict would become abstract in his own mouth. He remembers the first burdened houses, the hidden pregnancies, the laboring women, the rooms in which fear tried to become language. The households learning to lower their expectations from joy to mere survival. When Enoch speaks judgment, he is not forgetting them. He is honoring them by refusing to let their sorrow remain unnamed in heaven's court. That is why judgment in this story is not anti-human. It is pro-truth and therefore pro-human. It refuses to let the daughters of men disappear beneath the legend of giant suns. It refuses to let the earth's cry be muffled by the noise of renown. It refuses to let power continue narrating itself as destiny. I think that is beautiful in its severity. Beautiful, not because destruction is lovely. Beautiful because the weak are not forgotten. The old faith lives by this word more than many people realize. God remembers Noah. God remembers his covenant. God remembers the afflicted. To say God remembers in a violent age is not to imply he had forgotten and then suddenly recalled. It means he acts in fidelity to what is true. Emotionally tonight, that matters because the mothers, fathers, and witnesses of this story may feel erased by the scale of the rebellion. The verdict says they are not erased. Heaven has kept the record rightly. And so the message to the watchers becomes terrible. Not terrible because it is excessive. Terrible because it is fitting. They crossed the boundary. They corrupted the earth. They instructed violence. They multiplied sorrow. They cannot bless what they have broken. They cannot save what they have deformed. They cannot finally keep their sons from the consequences their own rebellion set in motion. There is no more room in the chamber for glamour. Only proportion. Only truth. Only the hard mercy of naming evil as evil before the whole age has learned to call it normal forever. This is also where Noah becomes more visible behind the horizon of the text. If judgment is coming, preservation must also be prepared. Enoch does not become the final refuge. He becomes the clear witness who helps the generation understand why refuge must come from God's own action, not from human cleverness. The age cannot engineer its way out of the wound that heaven's rebellion brought into earth. It can only be answered by the Creator who still owns both heaven and earth rightly. And that leads to the title return sentence the whole script has been earning. Tonight we did not stand first on the mountain to admire the strangeness of ancient rebels. We stood in the human room, where their rebellion became flesh. We stood beside the mothers, who carried what they could not explain. We stood beside the fathers, whose homes became too small for what heaven's disorder had brought into them. We stood beside the witness, who understood that ordinary houses were bearing a sorrow large enough to summon judgment. That is the true heart of the title. The night heaven and earth collided was not first felt as theory, but as birth. Not first as cosmic speculation, but as a woman's labor. Not first as a scholar's puzzle, but as a village's dread. And because it was felt there, in the human room, heaven's answer must also be heard there. The verdict is therefore not merely against the watchers in some remote celestial sense. It is for the violated order of creation. It is for the daughters of men. It is for the households. It is for the earth tired of blood. It is for the future beyond devouring. Judgment is the severe form mercy takes when the wound has gone too far to be soothed by gentler means. Enoch's role in this is almost unbearably tender to me. He is not the destroyer. He is not the judge. He is the faithful human witness. He is the man who walked with God long enough to carry a word that his generation needed and would not have invented for itself. A lesser man might have chosen admiration. Another might have chosen despair. Enoch chooses witness. That choice is why he stands at the hinge of the story. There is also a mercy hidden inside the severity of a verdict. Once God has spoken, the age no longer has the right to keep interpreting itself according to appetite. The powerful lose the privilege of self-description. The watchers cannot rename violation as desire. The mighty sons cannot rename devouring as greatness. The villages cannot go on calling exhaustion peace. A holy sentence strips false names from things. That is painful, but it is also liberating. The weak do not have to keep wondering whether what crushed them was perhaps normal after all. Heaven's verdict returns clarity to the very people corruption had taught to doubt their own moral sight. I imagine Enoch delivering such words with a face marked more by grief than by triumph. A man who loves God truly does not become excited at the thought of ruin, even necessary ruin. He becomes clear. He becomes obedient. He becomes unwilling to stand between the age and the truth that must judge it. That kind of obedience has a trembling dignity. It is not flashy. It is not eager. It is simply faithful enough to say what must be said, even when saying it isolates the speaker from every comfortable compromise his generation still wants to keep. And perhaps the mothers, hearing even fragments of the verdict, felt something complicated pass through them. Not simple relief, not simple fear. Perhaps a painful recognition that God had seen their houses fully after all. To be seen in one's sorrow can comfort and undo at the same time. It means the burden was real. It means the nights were not exaggerated. It means heaven did not misread the hidden rooms. I think that possibility belongs in the chamber because judgment is not only for rebels, it is also the answer given to sufferers who needed the truth of their experience upheld before the whole moral order of the world. Another mercy of the verdict is that it breaks the spell of false inevitability. Corrupted ages always suggest that nothing else could have happened, that power simply does what power does, that the weak must adjust and call adjustment wisdom. God's answer shatters that lie. It declares that rebellion was never destiny, only rebellion. It declares that devouring was never greatness, only corruption with a louder voice. Such truth does not merely punish. It frees the moral imagination of the righteous from the hypnosis of the age. Noah's shadow, though still future, gives the verdict one more shade of tenderness. God is not speaking only to end a world. He is speaking to preserve the possibility of a cleansed one. Enoch may not carry the wood of the ark, but he carries the moral explanation for why an ark will be mercy rather than excess. Without witness, preservation can look strange. With witness, preservation becomes intelligible as love refusing to surrender creation to what deforms it. And once truth is spoken, the night no longer needs disguise. It can become grave, honest, and merciful all at once for weary hearts again. Yet we are almost near the point where analysis must loosen its grip. The verdict has been spoken. The moral frame is clear. The houses have been honored. The weak have not been forgotten. We have gone close enough to the heart of it that the night no longer needs more force. It needs quiet. Tonight we did not stand first on the mountain, or in the council of the rebels, or in the later legends that made them seem grand. We stood in the human room where their rebellion finally became flesh, and where the collision of heaven and earth was first felt, not as theory, but as birth. The next chamber must no longer press harder. It must let the story become safe to rest in. The judgment has been named. The witness has carried the burden. The room can now exhale into a different kind of speech. The story is safe to rest in now, and the listener is invited away from analysis into quiet nearness. What does it feel like to stop carrying the story farther tonight and let the night hold what has already been said? We have gone close enough to the heart of it now, close enough to the mothers, close enough to Enoch, close enough to the sorrow in the houses and the firmness in the verdict. There is no need to press deeper tonight. No need to reopen the mountain. No need to count the names again. No need to stand once more in the birth room and ask it for another answer. The story has already given what it needed to give. So now, dear friend, let it become a place of rest rather than a task to keep carrying. Let Hermon remain where it is, dark against the distance. Let the villages below it fall quiet. Let the witness walk out of sight for the evening. Let the mothers who carried so much be held now in the mercy of being remembered. No one is asking you to solve their sorrow tonight. No one is asking you to push farther into judgment or farther into fear. The lamp may simply burn lower. The room may simply soften. The breath may simply become less effortful. than it was a few moments ago. Perhaps imagine the story resting in layers now. The mountain far away, the houses still, the earth under everything. The sky no longer leaning downward in trespass, but stretching back into holy distance where it belongs. That is enough for this hour. Enough to know the boundary matters. Enough to know the mothers were not forgotten. Enough to know the righteous witness did not speak into emptiness. Enough to know that even terrible stories can be held gently once they have been told truthfully. You do not need to carry the giants now. You do not need to hold the weight of the verdict in your hands. You do not need to keep watch over the whole age. Only this moment, only this breath, only this dim room where the story has come to rest beside you instead of pressing upon you. If you wish, you may picture one lamp in a quiet house after everyone has finally stopped speaking. Not the house of panic, not the house of first shock, a later, gentler stillness. A room with woven shadows on the wall, a bowl set aside, a folded cloth, the small sounds of wood settling, the kind of room where no one is demanding one more answer before sleep. That is the room we borrow now. And Enoch, too, may be left in peace for the night. He has walked, he has witnessed, he has carried what he was given to carry. Now let him disappear into the faithful dark, the way old righteous figures often do in the mind, not abandoned, not erased, simply no longer needing to speak. The mothers may rest there too, in the mercy of being seen rightly, not judged by the burden they carried, not reduced to a legend's machinery, just remembered. Sometimes remembrance is one of the gentlest forms of shelter. Nothing more needs to be extracted. Nothing more needs to be proved. The night is allowed to become a night again. The body is allowed to become a body again. The story is allowed to stop at enough. You may let the shoulders lower without instruction. Let the jaw forget its work. Let the forehead unlearn its effort. Let the tongue rest from forming thoughts that do not need to be finished tonight. Outside, in imagination, the land has grown quiet. No running feet. No raised voices. Only distance, stars, stone, and the patient dark that belongs to a world after words have been spoken. Even the earth, which had to bear so much in the story, may now be felt simply as ground beneath you. Steady ground, not demanding anything, just holding. And above it all, a holiness that does not need your vigilance in order to remain holy. That can be a comfort. You do not need to keep heaven in its place tonight. You do not need to keep the world from breaking again. You do not need to become Enoch, or Noah, or Adam, or the mother in the birth room. You may simply be here, listening, breathing. Let the title loosen now, not vanish. Loosen. It has already done its work. It has already taken us where we needed to go. Now, it may rest as a distant phrase, like a remembered doorway far behind you, while the night in front of you becomes softer and less historical and more immediate. This room, this breath, this lowering light, this permission to stop. Let the night widen a little now. Let the scene grow less detailed and more mercifully soft around the edges. Stone remains stone. Air remains air. Darkness remains only darkness, not a threat needing interpretation. The body can take comfort from such ordinary continuities. Whatever the story carried, the room around you can be simple again. A resting room, a quiet room, a room where no one is asking the mind to hold the whole burden of ancient sorrow for 1 minute longer. If a thought returns to the mothers, let it return gently and then pass. If a thought returns to Enoch, let it bow once and grow still. If a thought returns to the mountain, let it remain distant, as though seen across many fields under evening blue. Nothing needs to come close now except rest itself. The story has already approached. The night may now withdraw into kindness, into slower breathing, into the soft honesty of being a tired creature who does not need to finish the world before sleeping. There can be a great kindness in leaving one lamp lit only in imagination. Not bright enough to awaken, just bright enough to suggest that the room is companioned. A little warmth on one wall, a little gold on the lip of a bow, a little hush gathered near the floorboards. Such images do not ask for analysis. They simply give the heart somewhere calm to stand while the mind becomes less crowded. Stay there if you like, with that small lamp and that faithful hush, and let everything else recede. You may also let the body feel its own weight in a friendly way. The weight of the blanket, the weight of the arms at rest, the weight of the head needing nothing from thought now. Sometimes sleep begins not in total silence, but in a gentler relation to weight, nothing pressing, only being held, only being supported, only being allowed to stop keeping oneself arranged against the day. The night is kind enough for that, and this ending is kind enough for that too. Beyond the room, if you imagine any world at all, let it be a very quiet one. Far fields, a dark ridge, perhaps the sense of old stone cooling after the day, perhaps a breeze too soft to disturb anything. No urgency travels across that distance now. No message, no warning, no question. Just spacious, dark, and the relief of not having to follow any road farther tonight. You can remain where you are and still be fully allowed to rest. Rest can be very plain now. Plain in the best way. No hidden meaning. No symbol to decode. Only the simple kindness of not being asked for strength after strength has already been spent. The night is good at this sort of mercy. It covers without burying. It quiets without erasing. It lets what has been heard remain heard, while also letting the listener drift beyond the edge of active thought into something softer and less effortful. If the imagination wants one final landscape, let it be a distant ridge beneath a star-washed sky, with no movement upon it, and no story unfolding there now. The ridge is only a shape in darkness. The sky is only sky. The distance stays distant. There is relief in that. Not every horizon must be entered. Not every outline must become an event. Some things may remain far enough away to help you rest. And inside the room, perhaps there is only the sense of a settled hush. Not silence strained tight, but hush at ease with itself. The kind that gathers after a book is closed and before sleep has fully come, when the body is neither working nor yet dreaming, only loosening. Stay in that hush. It knows how to hold unfinished thoughts until morning without letting them trouble you in the night. Let the last wakeful thoughts become fewer now, like footsteps fading down a far corridor, until only quiet remains in the listening room. And even that quiet may soften farther, growing wider and gentler with each passing breath, while the night keeps watch kindly around you before sleep gathers you in. If a last image helps, let it be small. A single lamp almost finished. A folded manuscript left closed. A quiet threshold. A faithful dark that asks nothing more of you. Stay there. Stay with the gentleness of enough. The final chamber will not ask you to think harder. It will only keep quiet company beside you until the night can carry you the rest of the way into rest. No more analysis. Only quiet company, lowered light, and the mercy of enough. What if the night does not need one more answer? Only a gentle companion who remains nearby while you rest. So now we keep the simplest watch. Not the watch of the rebel. Not the watch of anxious thought. Only the quiet watch of companionship. The kind that stays near without demanding speech. The kind that does not pull you back into the story, but sits beside the closed door after the story has ended. The lamp is very low now, The room is gentler than it was. Whatever in the earlier sections felt sharp has already passed through language and can grow still. You do not need to lift it again. You do not need to test yourself with one more difficult image. You do not need to prove attentiveness by staying mentally upright. Rest asks less than that. It asks only permission. Permission for the body to be ordinary. Permission for the night to be sufficient. Permission for unfinished thoughts to remain unfinished without becoming threats. If there is any lingering weight from the mothers, let it settle into compassion rather than strain. If there is any lingering solemnity from Enoch, let it settle into steadiness rather than alertness. If there is any memory of the mountain, let it remain far away, where it can no longer press on the room. The room itself may now become the only thing worth noticing. The still air, the soft dark behind closed eyes, the faint sense of shelter around your breathing, the simple fact that nothing more is required. Sometimes that is the hardest mercy to accept. That enough has already been said. That enough has already been understood. That the soul may stop gathering and start receiving. So receive the quiet now. Receive the lowered light. Receive the gentle anonymity of not having to do anything remarkable for the next little while. You do not need to rescue the story. You do not need to rescue history. You do not need to rescue the people in the text by thinking about them harder. They have been honored. The truth has been spoken. The page may remain still. And maybe, if it helps, imagine that old house again, but emptied of fear now. Not rewritten, just quiet. A room after speech. A lamp after labor. A threshold no one is crossing anymore. A night that has resumed its patient creaturely rhythm. Wood resting. Stone cooling. Airs settling. Fabric unmoving. That kind of stillness can teach the body what to do next, without instruction. Nothing dramatic. Nothing spiritualized beyond reach. Just the old wisdom of quiet things. If thoughts return, let them pass, like someone moving softly through another room of the house. No need to follow, no need to answer, no need to reopen. A closed page can remain closed. A finished section can remain finished. A faithful ending can remain enough. I will keep the companion watch here a little longer, and it will be a very small watch. Not a probing one. Not a searching one, only the kind that says you are allowed to drift without apology, allowed to become less verbal, allowed to stop arranging meaning, allowed to sink a little farther beneath the surface of thought into the softer layer where sleep begins to gather. The breath may be slower now, or not. Either is fine. The body may feel heavier now, or simply quieter. That is fine too. There is no performance here, no score to reach, no perfect calm to achieve, only a gentle narrowing of attention until the night itself is doing most of the holding. If the heart is still a little awake, let it be awake in a smaller room, a room with less echo, a room with no demand, a room where even concern grows softer because there is nowhere it needs to go right now. Outside that room, all large things may remain large without your help. Inside that room, you may be small in the best way. A resting creature, a breathing creature, a held creature. That is enough dignity for this hour. Let the dark be unhurried. Let the pillow be simply a place to be met. Let the night air be a quiet companion at the edge of the face. Let the hands forget their effort. Let the mouth soften. Let the eyes remain closed without needing to search behind them. The companion watch can be almost invisible now. Just a sense that you are not alone at the edge of sleep, and yet not being kept awake by company either. The best kind of companionship at this hour is light enough not to disturb the water it protects. A nearness that does not intrude. A care that does not speak over your quiet. A presence content to become smaller and smaller until the only thing left is ease. If the mind tries one last time to gather the themes together, let that effort loosen by itself. There is nothing to assemble, nothing to preserve by vigilance. The words have already found their place on the page, and the page is not going anywhere. You may leave every idea where it lies. Sleep does not require completed architecture. It only requires a gentle willingness not to keep building. Let the tools of thought lie still. Let the inner room remain unfinished in a peaceful way. Perhaps the kindest final rhythm is simply this: less to hold, less to solve, less to name, less to prove. A little less effort in the face, a little less listening for what is next, a little less reaching after the next sentence before it arrives. And because there is less, there can also be more room for rest, more room for quiet, more room for the soft blankness in which sleep approaches without announcement and does not need to be greeted with anything but consent. Even the heartbeat can be left alone now. No measuring, no correcting, no trying to slow it by force. Just trust that the body knows many old ways of descending into rest if it is not interrupted too often by thought. The body has been carrying you much longer than the mind has been narrating the journey. Let the body lead for a while. Let the breath follow. Let the dark stay gentle and uninsistent around both. The quiet can be trusted now, a little more than before. It does not need to entertain you. It does not need to prove itself safe with dramatic reassurance. Its safety can be small, almost modest. The steadiness of the mattress, the hidden warmth under the blanket, the repeated return of breath, the ordinary darkness that asks for nothing and gives a kind of shelter simply by remaining undemanding. Small safeties are often the ones that carry us across the final distance into sleep. If there is one last act of kindness you can offer yourself, let it be the kindness of not insisting on a perfect ending. A gentle ending is enough. A half-waking ending is enough. A drifting ending is enough. Sleep does not need a polished ceremony. It often comes through the side door, while the heart is no longer guarding the front. So let the guard lower. Let the side door remain open. Let the quiet enter without announcement. Soon, even these words can grow spare. Fewer thoughts, fewer edges, fewer reasons to remain fully awake. Just darkness, breath, softness, and time passing kindly. The night knows what to do with such simple materials. It has always known. You can let it do that work now. And if sleep still waits just beyond the next few breaths, that is all right. Waiting can be gentle too. You do not have to force the crossing. You can simply lie here with the room grown kind around you, with the page closed, with the lamp low, with nothing left to explain. The night is patient. It knows how to receive a tired mind slowly. It knows how to gather a body by degrees, softening the edges first, then the thoughts, then the listening, until at last even the wish to stay awake becomes small enough to set down without effort. And when the final hush arrives, you may let it carry you the remaining distance softly and naturally, with no more work asked from your mind, your hands, your breathing, or your tired heart tonight, until even the smallest effort fades, and resting feels easier than staying near the shore of thought. And if some part of you is still listening for a final sentence, let it be this: you have gone far enough for tonight, far enough into the story, far enough into the question, far enough into the old sorrow. There is no prize beyond this point. Only rest. Only the mercy of stopping. Only the companion watch that stays a little while, and then grows so quiet you no longer need to notice it at all. So rest safely beneath the preserved words. Let the long night hold you gently. Let the room remain kind. Let the dark remain soft. Let sleep arrive without being hurried. And if it arrives slowly, let it arrive slowly. Nothing is lost by gentleness. Nothing is required beyond this stillness. I am leaving the lamp low. I am leaving the page closed. I am leaving the room peaceful. Good night.